Hello, it's Grayson here with a special guest today, Rob Noerr. Some of you might be familiar with Rob, some of you might not be. He's a political streamer and debater. I think, Rob, I first became aware of you in some of the debates that you had several years ago with Destiny. So you are very experienced on debating Trump, politics, this particular topic. You've been doing this for how many years now at this point?
I think I started my YouTube channel 6 years ago. I've probably been live streaming for about 4 years. But
Gotcha.
actually, even before politics, I was interested. I was a collegiate debater. So I did policy, NDTC debate in college for a small state university called Clarendon University. So
Cool. So
that's when
yeah,
I first got interested.
this is going to be one of my first political debates on this channel. Typically, you guys are used to seeing me debating science and pseudoscience subjects. Um, I wanted to start out with a challenge. I didn't want to just be a typical debate bro and go to some college campus and debate people that are not used to this. So I wanted to start out with a challenge. Rob's been doing this for a long time. I think that, he's read a lot on these subjects. He's had a lot of these debates. So not starting off easy here. And yeah, I've been having this conversation in my personal life a lot. I think it's highly relevant. So we'll see if you guys are interested in this kind of political discussion. And obviously, politics is not independent of science. The two are related. The progress of science does depend on politics to some degree. So we might get into that today. I first wanted to start off maybe by asking a little bit about Rob, just to make sure that, I want to make it very clear that Rob is not a flat earther. He's not a young earth creationist. I don't know if Rob prescribes to any pseudoscience. I don't know a lot about Rob's position, so I'm hoping that we can tease that out in some of the questions. So, Rob, just to start off the base, are you religious? Are you Christian? Are you secular? Do you
Sure.
broadly prescribe to any denomination or?
I would call myself non-denominational Christian, but
Okay.
also a bad Christian because a lot of the people because I am right wing, I consider
Okay.
myself a populist first and foremost. Then I consider myself like a minarchist or a libertarian adjacent, and then thirdly a conservative. So a lot of my conservative audience doesn't like some of my religious takes. For example, being more for small government. I am okay with gay marriage. That's very unpopular amongst my circles. But so yeah, I do believe that I am a Christian. I believe that Jesus was the Son of God. I don't find myself to be well studied in a direct reading of the Bible.
Okay.
Growing up, I went to a church that literally just didn't have a preacher. So there was like 12 of us there, and people would just take turns from other churches in the local town just coming. So you kind of just had someone who was like, I thought this passage was cool. I wanted to talk about it. So never
So,
was very denominational.
before like 2015 and Trump entering into politics, how involved were you in politics? And also, kind of just tangential off of what I just asked, how much do you feel that your religious views like inform your politics or vice versa? Do you consider them separate or integrated?
I think that my religious views probably a lot more help direct my cultural views than my political views. I think that because I'm for small government and I don't consider myself a libertarian, but I'm close to that. For me, the goal of politics that I'm looking at the most, the value that I'm most interested in is personal liberty and freedom. So that oftentimes conflicts with what I think you should do morally. For example, I am someone who would be morally against someone getting into a field like OnlyFans, but I don't prescribe that the government should make that illegal necessarily. So there is a conflict between what I think should be moral or not versus what our government should be doing. I think our government should be limited. And so religion, in that sense, although it does affect my culture, which I think politics is downstream of, I don't think that my religious views affect my political views much. Before Trump, I did policy debate in college, and I started to get political. So I'm 40, so I graduated high school in 2002. So September 11th happened my senior year. I was like everyone else that was like a pissant 17-year-old was like, get them. Whoever did this, get them. It took 2 or 3 years of being into college. A bunch of left-wing friends I had there. I sort of started to become this Ron Paul Republican type guy. And I was very distrusting of government institutions. My lefty friends in debate were like left of Bernie Sanders, super left. And they thought that my sort of small government views on like taxation and stuff were nonsensical. But they liked the fact that I was protesting George Bush and the Iraq War. So I was involved. I went to protest. I went to like a G20 thing that happened in Pittsburgh. I forget what year that was. and I certainly was involved in the debate community and arguing sort
Okay.
of my political views there.
So this is really fascinating, and it's actually touching on a lot of the points that I had wanted to discuss. Like one of the points I was going to bring up about why I would consider Trump to be bad for the world was going to be a rollback of human rights and freedoms. So we can go from that angle. I was going to touch on that maybe first, but you also touched about like sort of it sounded like a non-interventionist or small government kind of stance, which I definitely want to hear your takes on some of these Trump cabinet nominees that have been being rolled out, like that seem like neocon interventionists, like they just are desperate to start a war in Iran. So I wanted maybe we could just lay it out of the 3 points that I wanted to talk about at some point about why I think Trump will be bad is, like I said, human rights and freedoms rollback. I think bad for the environment and scientific progress. And then the third point was going to be bad for global stability, which we could talk about foreign policy at that part and Ukraine and Israel and everything there about Iran, intervention, all that stuff. So those are the 3 points I wanted to talk about. Okay. And maybe you can go like, I bring up a point about why I think Trump will be bad. We can talk about it. Then you can bring up a point about why you think Trump will be good. We talk about that. How's that sound?
Sounds, I think, how about this? You can go through all your points simultaneously and we'll organically see if it goes somewhere else. But I think maybe if we gave sort of an overview on why we come from our positions, because I'll clearly be taking the side that I think a Trump presidency will be good. So if you give me 2 to 3 minutes, I could explain why I think a Trump presidency will be good and not very bad. And then obviously if you've kind of already done that, but if you want to articulate more, that's fine. And then we could go point by point through your points and we'll see where it goes. Okay. Does that work for you?
I've got notes. I can write down your points.
Okay. So I'll try to keep this within 3 minutes. For me, the central issue in our government today is that whether you're on the right, on the left, you're a Bernie supporter, you're a Trump supporter, you're a Jeb Bush supporter, whatever you may be, Jill Stein, anything in between, our government does not care about the interest of the American people, whether it be through incompetence, through the fact that it's just become this unmanageable, huge bureaucracy, or it's through corruption or incompetence. I forget which one I said already. The average will of the voter is not something that's entertained by the people that really run our government. The people that really run things aren't necessarily the elected officials. They will come and go. But it's more the bureaucrats behind the scenes that are unelected, in tandem with a bunch of people with cultural power, like people that are billionaires, people that are in charge of aspects like social media, corporate America, academia, the entertainment industry, etc. These institutions really run our country, and they're not really concerned about you, the average person, whether you be on the right, left, atheist, Christian, whatever, black, white, doesn't matter to them. They're interested in entrenching their own power, and this means that they will be corrupt if it means to stopping someone that they think is outside of that control of their power. Donald Trump got elected, and I supported him in 2016, in this promise of draining the swamp. And I voted for him for 2 reasons. One was so that the average person could see that this swamp exists and how dangerous it is. And that certainly has been proven because of the hubris of the people in these institutions like the FBI that couldn't help themselves. They outed their corruption, that they were in tandem with the mainstream media, academia, and all these other places. And then secondly, which Trump did not do a good job of, is now that we know this and the average person sees it, do something about it. I think Trump is better positioned this time, and a lot of the appointments that he's been making and things that he's been talking about is designed to actually do something about that corruption. And the goal is that this would actually be a saving grace for this country and the world, because we could get back to governance by people that actually cared about their constituents rather than entrenching their own power. We could get back to a government where our elected leaders were the ones that had power and therefore accountability, as opposed to unelected bureaucrats that we have no power over. So that's ultimately why I support Donald Trump. For all the issues you talked about, I think that I will be able to clearly articulate why I think Trump would be better for things like personal freedoms, for the environment, and all of those issues, because a precursor to having a discussion, for example, let's say me and you have a lengthy disagreement about what our regulation should be on water purity when it comes to a specific, watershed in my state's Pennsylvania, right? We might have a vehement disagreement, but the truth is it doesn't matter what me and you think. No one gives a shit. You better hope that the people at the CIA agree with you. You better hope that the people in corporate America agree with you that are actually controlling the levers of power. because whatever our disagreement is and who's right and who's wrong becomes irrelevant if we don't have a voice. Okay. And I don't think there's been an election that illustrates that more than the Democratic Party literally lying to people for years about Joe Biden's cognitive health, then waiting till he was the de facto winner of the primary, then forcing Joe Biden out so that they could
off the topic.
Well, just real quick, let me finish. Okay. To install someone in Kamala Harris that no Democratic voter voted for. So it is a clear illustration that they represent not the will of the people. They actually represent institutional power. And I think Trump, with a coalition of RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, and a bunch of people like that, illustrate the exact opposite.
All right. I think that you made your point in the first half and then kind of started to talk about Biden and Kamala when, like, our debate is about Trump and whether he's going to be good or bad. But okay, I'll let you.
But just real quick, if my position is that there is this institutional control, right, and that Trump represents a break from that, then I think it's completely reasonable to talk about the people involved in that institutional control.
Okay, yeah, but like again, I don't want to debate Kamala and Biden. I think that we're past that, but I mean, I can't.
I'm talking about the DNC and
that we could debate on those points. I just don't want to get bogged down on those points.
That's fine, but let me be clear. I'm not talking about Biden or Kamala. Like, I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the people that control them.
All right.
That lied.
That's fine. That's fine.
Right. You understand the difference?
Focus on the future here about the impacts that are going to come, right? Because there's so much to talk to. Because I think that we do agree on the problems and we disagree on the solutions. Like the problems that you articulated here about like billionaire elite influence in our politics, the corruption, which I would attribute to lobbying. And I don't think Trump's going to do any rules to change the nature of lobbying. So I don't think that addresses the actual fundamental issue. The unelected bureaucrats thing, I hear you. And I would like to get your take on just the concept of expertise in general, right? Because generally, you'd think that you would want relevant experts in positions where they can use their expertise to make decisions that are informed. And I don't know how, like, you know, if you want to open up every single, like, decision-making position in the executive branch of government up for a vote, like, how is the average person supposed to vote for who's going to make the better decisions at the NIH? Like, they're not informed for those kinds of picks. You know, like, at what point do you have the experts in a field making the decisions? And at what point do you say, well, I don't trust the experts to make an informed decision. I want the Democratic people to make those decisions or to appoint those experts. Like, do you know what I'm trying to get at here?
Well, let me see if I can re-articulate your position, Steelman, your position. You tell me if you think this is accurate. Not every position in a bureaucracy should be elected through purely democratic means. For example, if we said who would be the best undersecretary at the Department of Health, the average person would have no clue. So if you just put that up for a vote, it would be difficult for them to say, oh, I think Barry Smith would be better than Lisa Grunwald because, you know, what I'm really looking for an undersecretary, right, they wouldn't have a clue. So you're saying at some point you appoint people that you then trust in these specific agencies to appoint experts that maybe me and you and the average person doesn't have a voice on, but at some point we can't have pure democracy on every issue. Is that?
Yeah. And that was actually a very articulate way of, I think that you expressed that better than I did. And I just want to make one point is that is one reason I don't like Donald Trump's picks is that I feel like he's appointing people for ideological reasons rather than appointing people who are experts in those areas, like the EPA, right? He just appointed Lee Zeldin, who's never taken a course in environmental science or anything. I mean, he's not a relevant expert for the EPA at all. He's like a big oil guy. Like he's a congressman that's very cozy up to big oil interests. So like these are the things that I think are bad, to be appointing people that do not have the relevant expertise to be heads of departments where that expertise is important for day-to-day decisions.
Okay, so there's several things to say about this. I guess maybe the easiest way to go about it would be to remind you what I think my worldview is, which is that these bureaucracies have become so entrenched that they actually wield the power and they're not responsive to the American people at all. They sort of exist outside the scope of our democracy, of our republic. And so it's not a matter of giving me an up-down vote for all of us on an undersecretary of health. It's a matter of they should at least hear the will of the people and try to exist and try to govern to the benefit of the will of the people, not oh, what we really mean by democracy, and this is what these institutions mean, is what we collectively as institutions agree with. And if the people disagree with us, then they're a threat to democracy. And we could get into the specifics of this, where you see with a lot of the calls to censor disinformation online, they say it's because it's a threat to democracy. They don't mean a threat to the will of the people. They mean a threat to their bureaucracies. That's what matters. What matters when they call democracy, what they mean is what the FBI thinks, what the Department of Health thinks, what people at Facebook think, what academia thinks. They don't mean what each person means, what the collective will of the people is. And so if we start with that assumption, and that there's either corruption or entrenched bureaucracy, that means that the average person not only no longer has a say, but they're completely irrelevant to this discussion, then when you say expert, what you're really saying is people that exist within that entrenched bureaucracy that don't care about the will of the people. Because who would be an expert but for the people that are already in that bureaucracy? So I would liken it to this. You can imagine a hierarchy or a system of governance that's corrupt, correct? That's something that you could imagine. Let's say, hypothetically, can I ask you this real quick? I don't mean to presume anything. Would you identify as more left-leaning, like with your politics?
Yeah.
Okay.
Generally.
I don't want to make presumptions, so you tell me if I say something that doesn't accurately represent you. But would you be someone that believed that in the United States in the past, particularly maybe in the Jim Crow South, that we had police departments that were racist and corrupt?
Yeah.
Okay, so imagine then if I said, well, I'm not besmirching the people of this town, but let's say I say Athens, Georgia, right? And hypothetically, it was terribly racist in 1930. I don't know that, but let's say that's true. And the police department was corrupt, and they're framing black men, and they're planting drugs on them, and they're just framing them. And I say, look, when a new sheriff comes into town and he starts appointing deputies, he has to appoint someone who's an expert on law enforcement in Athens, Georgia. And you would say, but Rob, that's a problem because everyone that's been involved in law enforcement in Athens, Georgia has done so in a corrupt regime. We need someone from outside of that. That's the exact argument I would make when it comes to sort of these agencies that you're talking about. If you're going to drain the swamp, the problem is that Trump found out in 2016 that all of the people to work on his campaign and then the tens of thousands of people that you have to have appointed once you become president, who is qualified for that? Well, it's going to be people that have perpetually existed within that bureaucracy. So if you appoint someone that's outside the scope of it, the criticism will always be, but they're not an expert. And one little thing I'll say in addition to this is I'll bet you didn't criticize when we saw people like Pete Buttigieg being appointed to Department of Transportation. So this happens quite frequently where people are put. It's the only expertise that Pete Buttigieg had was being part of this bureaucity. That's it. Wait. He's not like an engineer. Sure.
I am not a fan of Pete Buttigieg, and I really was not a fan of his appointment. I will make that clear. But I want to explain why I think that what you just laid out is not analogous to what we're talking about. I understand when you're saying, like, you know, who is qualified to be put in charge of the CIA or the FBI? Well, the only people that are qualified are the people that were brought up in those institutions, and those people are going to be corrupt, blah, blah. I understand the nature of your argument for certain departments, but in other departments where the expertise, like to be appointed the head of the EPA, you don't need to have been brought up in the EPA swamp or whatever you want to call it. You could appoint somebody that just has a degree in environmental science they could be totally unrelated, just a relevant expert in the science.
I disagree. What do you think the average political leanings of someone with a degree in environmental science is?
Very left. I mean,
right.
The
That's
same
correct.
can be said for somebody with a degree in theoretical physics.
The point is, then what you're suggesting is there is an agency that exists, the Environmental Protection Agency. People that believe in small government thinks that it's overly burdensome, that it is corrupt, that it specifically targets specifics and individual. In fact, it's ironic. You criticize lobbying. Well, the best way to take away the effect of lobbying is to stop giving the government so many powers with regulations. Because the way it works is this. Some company that wants to pollute, what they do is they pay off and grease the correct wheels in government. Then regulations are implanted that they have loopholes that they could get out of, and those regulations actually affect the people that are more small businesses, people that are more likely.
I
So
agree.
the point, so I'll put a bow on it just real quick. So I think that the point you're making is you're suggesting that experts be appointed from a pool of people that will already be theoretically in this swamp. Because remember, the swamp that I'm talking about, I already included much of academia, which is why it's a very good thing what Trump's suggesting about the Department of Education and taking away credentials from universities that are actually more interested in teaching things like DEI than actual hard sciences.
Okay, let's definitely talk about that next then,
Sure.
because first of all, yeah, very curious about how you consider the swamp to include academia. First of all, I just want to say, like, when you're saying that these, climate scientists or environmental scientists, or like I said, theoretical physicists tend to be on towards the left compared to the average, that's just a statistic. You can find right-leaning, relevant scientific experts.
Name me one.
Pool is smaller, but those are available.
Cool. Name me one. Who
You don't
should Trump have put?
go and just appoint some coal lobbyists like Trump did in his first term.
Name me one.
Name you
Go
one.
ahead. Right. Name me one right-leaning environmental scientist that graduated from one of these universities that you would think would qualify
So
as an expert.
your position, right, is that because, and I will just clarify that it's not my field. I can't even name you one environmental scientist generally of any political leaning, but regardless of whether or not I can name them, are you trying to spread doubt that there even exists a right-leaning environmental scientist?
No, I'm assuming that there could be a handful of them, but I'm betting if they were appointed, even if not you specifically, what would happen would be people would say, but they're not well thought of in the field, right? People, and these people exist. For example, if he appointed someone that graduated from some degree from a university that you find credentialed that says, actually, I think climate change is massively overblown. Here's my research into it. I think that the people that say that climate change is such a threat, many of them are doing it for personal reasons because they exist to get government grants. If he appointed someone like that and they had a degree in environmental science, I bet you would say, this is a pseudoscientist. This is someone that we don't agree with. In effect, what you're doing is this. If you start from the position that an agency like the EPA is overly burdensome and that they're actually part of the problem because it encourages lobbying, and so you appoint someone that is from the side of it that's like an industry that has used the EPA to lobby, right? And you say, well, that person's not an expert. It would be the same as a president that wanted to criticize law enforcement, let's say the agency of the FBI, and they specifically pick like a bail activist, or they pick a defense attorney that argues vehemently for the defense of the accused. You would say, oh, but why would you appoint someone like that? Clearly you want to appoint someone from law enforcement, not from someone on the opposite side of that. But clearly you see the problem with that. How could you have significant reform if you only appoint people within that stand to come from an industry or come from a background that would suggest the self-importance of that agency and the need to promulgate it?
So your entire argument there seemed to start with a presupposition about, if we assume that the EPA is just overburdensome, blah, 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 why would I start with that presupposition?
So what do they do that's good? Go ahead.
Protect the environment.
In what way? Give me an example.
Okay, they regulate businesses to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Have they been doing a good job?
They've been doing a better job than their absence, but overall, mixed performance.
Compared to their absence, when?
Like, if we look at other countries that don't have an equivalent, or we look at before the history of the EPA. And
the other country is going to be clearly a false equivalency. Right? What are you comparing it to China?
What point are you trying to make right now, Rob? Are you saying that the EPA doesn't do anything to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions?
No, what I'm saying is you are starting under the assumption the EPA is doing what kind of job? And you're like, well, they're doing okay. It would be worse without them. My articulation is I don't think so. I don't think that there's any proof that the EPA that without the EPA would be in a situation that was massively worse. In fact, to the contrary, do you think Let's see if we can compare more apples to apples comparison. Were you okay with the EPA under Trump's first administration?
No.
Okay, and do you think they did a poor job?
Yes.
In what way? They didn't lower greenhouse gas emissions?
Not only did they not lower it, but they actually increased greenhouse gas emissions by like 200 million metric tons of CO2. They increased methane emissions, which are 20 times more potent than greenhouse gas emissions. They rolled back regulations on the proper disposal for coal plants that made the water quality worse off, I think, in your own state of Pennsylvania. So, like, yeah, they're increasing health risks, like negative health externalities for American people, and they're overall contributing to the increased rate of climate change, which is super bad for the human
So
species.
before we go on, I don't know. Perhaps you're absolutely right about this. I assume you feel you're well informed on this. It seems how you debate science. So you're absolutely certain that when Trump came into office in 2017 and when he left in 2020, greenhouse gas emissions were going up every year?
This is greenhouse gases due to the regulation rollbacks over the next decade. The 200 number that I just quoted from you is from an analysis up through 2025 based on, like, without the regulations in place over the next decade from when he rolled them back, how many excess greenhouse gas emissions will there be?
So just to be clear, my specific question was, did greenhouse gas emissions go up or down during Trump? You said went up. Now, you know that that's not the truth. You know they went down, correct? Just a yes or no will suffice.
Okay. I think we're talking about two different things.
No.
You really want me to say yes or no? Let me just clarify what we're talking about. What I'm comparing, right, is a comparison of the United States trajectory with Trump versus without Trump. What you're comparing is just the overall total greenhouse gas emissions per year, which is going to be multivariate because there's a lot more influencing that number than just Trump's policies.
Did the greenhouse gas emissions go up or down when Trump was in office?
They went up, but the rate of increase was basically plateauing.
Okay, so am I going to have to look up these numbers and see if the rate of the... So what you're saying is,
if you want to, but I don't think it's pertinent.
I do think it's pertinent, and here's why. Because what you're going to default to is, okay, even if, like, we were putting out X number of greenhouse gases a year, when you say they went up totally, this is interesting as well. Because, yes, you're right. Like, for example, whatever metric you want to use. Like, so what on average in the Obama years would be the amount of greenhouse gases? Like, give me a typical year under Obama of greenhouse gases. What would the measurement be?
You can just make up a number for sake of discussion.
But I don't even know how we measure that. That's the question. Like, what's the unit?
At million metric tons of CO2.
Okay, so can I just say this? It goes up before Trump, it went up 10 million metric tons. I'm pulling that number completely out of my ass, but just giving an idea of a number, right?
Okay.
So we have 100 million metric tons in the sky, and then 8 years of Obama, every year it's putting 10 million in. So the number's going up. We're putting more. Now there's 110 million. Then there's 120. Then there's 130. But the level of which it's going up is plateaued. If at Trump's tenure, and this is what you say, the total amount went up. So if in Trump's time that immediately drops his first year to 5 million metric tons, you would say, well, the total number went up because we added 5 million. But what I'm talking about is year to year, is that number going down? I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and you tell me if you think I'm wrong, what I'm referencing specifically isn't the total amount, because even 1/1000th of a metric ton being put in the air, which would be a remarkable success, you would admit, if that's what the U.S. put, that would still increase the total number. So what I'm asking you specifically is, did the number per year, the average per year, go down under the Trump administration?
No, it went up.
Can you show me the data?
Yes, I will. It's shared on screen. One of my moderators commented here, if you would like to look up their source here. Published May 2019 from Rhodium Group. CO2 emissions rose by 2.7% in 2018, which was the second largest annual increase since the year 2000.
So you stop at 2018. Why is that?
Because we are having this discussion on the fly. I didn't prepare these numbers in advance. This is just what a moderator in my chat
Okay, so
shared.
for example, I'm looking at, let me see where this comes from. From World Bank.
I just want to know what point you're trying to make. Like, if this data showed exactly what you hope it does, what is the point you're trying to make from this?
What I'm saying is the argument, we have to start under the supposition. You said, well, we have to discuss whether the EPA is achieving successes or not. So the first thing we need to do is look at a time period of the EPA and say whether or not they did good or bad. So you think they did well or not. So we take the Trump years, the first Trump administration, which seems to be something beneficial, right? If we're talking about how we suspect Trump will be in this term, we should look back to the previous term he has. That might give us some idea. You agree with that?
I don't know how much you can read to the second term based on the first term. I don't know how much that translates, to be
Okay,
honest.
well, I think that's as good of a comparison as we'll be able to make. And so in our attempt to do that, when you say, well, I think he did poorly.
I think you can make a much better comparison. And this comparison was made in a published study that I cited for you. I can share it on screen if you want. It's from,
that's fine. It just seems odd that it stops halfway through Trump's term.
No, that's not. It's a different one. This is the initial one. So this is what I initially quoted from you, that 200 million number. So this is the source for it. I know it's academia, so that you might already say that it's not true. But if we just scroll down to their first figure, this is their source for their data. This is, again, data from the EPA. Maybe you say, oh, it can't be trusted. But this is a comparison of based on these 2025 estimates, like I told you. This is comparing what the U.S. without these regulations that Trump took away versus if those regulations were still
that's
in place.
That's a different question. You once more have changed the question. So now we're dealing with academics that are saying, here is our estimates for what we think these policies will do. This is no different in economics when we had people like Paul Krugman say in 2016, here is our estimates with the things Trump has suggested, how it will crash the stock market and the economy will significantly decline if we elect Trump as president. Those estimates ended up being incorrect. And we oftentimes see that models and estimates from academics end up being incorrect. So what I'm talking about isn't some academic's estimate of what they think will happen. And we can see this all through every government agency and academia all the time. Constantly we see estimates of how much a specific plan will cost. And then it ends up costing way more or way less. And so I'm not interested in the estimate at this point. I'm interested in the actual tangible data that we can see. And I think you know that unless I'm wrong, and I'm willing to admit I'm wrong, that's why I'm asking for the specific data that shows greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, etc. Those types of emissions. We had 4 years of Trump. We've been 4 years removed from that. So now we can see the trends in that data. Did those trends go down over those 4 years of Trump, or did they go up? I'm not interested in what people think the policies that he implemented will do 10 years from now.
I'll show you the numbers. They did go up. Okay,
let's see them.
Make you happy. Here you go. So here's 2016, here's 2017, they went up, here's 2018, and then here's the pandemic, and then here's the Biden years. This goes up to 2022.
Okay, so real quick, can you go, I'm sorry, can you go to 2018?
This is not CO2, this is methane, which is 20 times more potent of a greenhouse.
Okay, so we're just looking at methane specifically.
And this can be attributed directly to Trump's policies because he specifically rolled back the regulations responsible for methane emissions for the oil and gas.
So just to be clear, this is just methane. It's not completely greenhouse. Secondly, it looks to me, I can't see, I don't have the greatest eyesight, but it looks to me that those numbers significantly went down in 2019. Correct?
Yeah, in 2019, they go back up to higher than the 2016 numbers.
Okay, so
overall,
the numbers...
it increases. It's the only year, except for, I guess, around here, where you see a significant increase is during Trump's first term. And then they cratered during Biden's term in office and during the pandemic when nobody is emitting. So
I just want to be clear. The numbers were already going down in 2019, correct? Without the pandemic, correct?
Sure.
Okay. Great.
I mean, this is just one. Trying to hang your hat on right now, Rob.
No, what I'm trying to hang my hat on is the people that say that Trump's going to be a disaster for the environment. When we say, well, how bad were things under the first term? And they say they were real bad. They were real. Let me finish. You say they were real bad. They were real bad. And then we look at the data. That doesn't look real bad. That looks pretty much in line, and we're continuing to see a downward trend.
It doesn't look real bad to you, Rob, because you have no education in climate science. I mean, come on. Like, why would you...
Your appeal to authority means nothing to me.
Why would you expect to be able to read this chart and just know instantly if it's good or bad? I mean, what would qualify you to have such, like, an ability to read a chart like this? I don't think that you do. But here... The thing is that if you want to focus specifically on the year between 2018 and 2019, but you want to try to get on me because earlier we were looking at 2017 to 2018, you're doing the same thing. If we compare Trump's entire term, right, It's a net increase, dude. That's exactly what you said was not the case.
That's
Now
not true.
Showing it's a net increase.
That's not true, right? First off, if you look at Trump's term versus Obama's term, it's clearly a net decrease. Yes or no?
2016 to 2019,
right?
Net increase. That's just a fact.
When he leaves in 2020, is it higher or lower than when he came in 2016?
Lower because of the pandemic.
Okay, so then when you say it's a fact, when you just said it's a fact that it was a net increase, that's not true.
Okay, so
at the end of its term, it was down,
correct?
correct?
Include 2020 data in the metrics of Trump's first performance because unemployment numbers, GDP, all those numbers are going to look pretty different for your boy Trump if we include the 2020 year in that data. Do you want to really do that?
Well, I think that that's why he lost the election, correctly. And so I'm certain that you and most Democrats included that data when it came to the decision who to vote for in the 2020 election, correct? So when it was convenient, that's not true at all. Of course they did.
You asked me what data I included in my decision. Well, that was not what I was including in my decision. But if you want to talk generally, sure, maybe that.
Right. So generally, that was the Democratic position. Sure. And look, we could probably say largely the reason Trump lost in 2020 was because of the economic numbers during the pandemic, correct?
It was a referendum on his handling of the pandemic, yeah.
Okay, in addition to that, I'm not quite sure how much those emissions, particularly these emissions of methane, would have went down because of that. I'm not specifically sure what that would be. We could see that they were already trending in that direction, and it's not like they cratered so much that it would be like, clearly this was an anomaly. It was continuing to trend in the direction that it was going. Thirdly, this is just specifically looking at methane.
It was not.
Right? That's not true. Show it. Bring up the chart. Bring up the chart again.
Okay, I will. It was not continuing the same trend. This is Trump's term. It is bucking the trend. Here's the trend line. Trump's term goes the opposite of the trend line.
It does not. It goes up for two. It goes up for 2 years, just like we can see there were 2 year periods prior that it went up. But again, let's look. When I say it was continuing the trend that we saw from the year previous, from the year of 2018 to 2019, was that drop more significant than from the year 2019 to the year 2020?
I don't know, Rob.
Why? You could see the data right there.
Because I wasn't okay. Go through what you're saying.
Put your mouse on it.
This is important. But what?
Put your mouse on it.
Yeah, okay, I'll put a mouse on it. I don't know why you're getting bogged down in this detail, but let's go. Which years?
2018.
Okay, 2018.
827. Go to 2019.
Uh-huh.
So that's a 20-point drop. Now go to 2020.
2020, okay.
Correct. And that's 795. What point drop is that?
It's a little bit over, 12 points or so.
Right. So the drop was more significant from 2018 to 2019 than 2019 to 20. Now, the point I'm trying to make is this. If you give me a moment, I'll articulate this. You're pointing to this saying, this was a disaster. Look at how bad this is. I think that anyone looking at this could see, actually, the trend seems to be a downward trajectory with spikes that go up through a lot of terms. Right? And it doesn't look like that number was uniquely bad to the point that you're like, oh my God, it's so much worse than we've seen in decades prior. In fact, what we see is the 2018 number. It looks remarkably similar to the 2015 number. So it doesn't seem like it was that much of an anomaly. And thirdly, to say that we can't look at that trend because 2020 was such an outlier because of COVID. But what I'm telling you is it wasn't such an outlier that it made the discrepancy between 2019 and 20 more larger than the difference between 2018 and 2019. Mm-hmm. All of this paints a picture that isn't, oh my God, Trump was so uniquely bad for the environment. And I remind you, this is just looking at methane. I think that what we were discussing first was greenhouse gas emissions in totality, and I believe that's more of a direct downward trend line, though I could be wrong about that. Nonetheless, the data... Okay, bring up the data. How do you not know this, by the way? If this is something you focus on so heavily and you have such strong, heartfelt beliefs that Trump was such a disaster when it came to these emissions, how don't you have a clue what the data says?
Because it's pretty obvious from the things that Trump says and the positions and policy positions that he has staked out that he has said on the record climate change is a hoax. He doesn't even believe in anthropogenic climate change in the first place. That is a pseudoscientific position. And that can be demonstrated empirically with science that is a pseudoscience position. So
it depends on what he means by that statement.
He appoints people like Wheeler, who he appointed to the EPA head in his first term, was a literal lobbyist for the coal industry. Okay. As the head of the EPA. Does that
emissions went down.
Does that not just automatically strike you as the exact kind of corruption that you were so against?
No, in fact, that seems like a very anti-scientific approach for you to take. So what you're suggesting now is ignore what the data was, and instead we just say, well, based on what Trump said, and based on the career of the person he appointed at the EPA, then it must be bad, despite the fact what the data shows. The data shows that this wasn't an anomaly so bad that it would be an outlier that you would say, oh my God, that's terrible. We just saw the data on methane. It doesn't show that.
We saw one chart of methane emissions that now you're trying to say was all of the supporting evidence that the EPA was performing poorly under Trump, which was never my argument. Again, you're the one who's wanting me to show you all the data in real time while we're having a discussion. We didn't prepare any of these talking points beforehand, right? I just think it's a little bit disingenuous for, that if the EPA cuts regulations that are designed to limit greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions are going to go up. I don't think, it's crazy to me that you're even arguing otherwise.
Okay, so let's remind everyone how we got to this point. You're talking about what a good job the EPA does, or why they're so necessary, and what a disaster it would be if we have someone appointed there that rolls back some of the regulations that the EPA's had. That's your position, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, then we ask specifically why. The first thing you give is the reason why is you're like, because the environment, particularly emissions. And you said greenhouse gas emissions and methane emissions specifically. That's what you said, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so now you're saying that you think it's unfair for me to ask for the data of how those emissions looked under the first 4 years of Trump, which you're admitting, much similarly to now, you're saying just like in this term, in his previous term, he picked someone that you thought was a career sort of fossil fuel guy who would be the exact type of person you wouldn't want leading this, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so then when I ask you, okay, then if you're saying it was a disaster in the first 4 years, can we look at the data of the two areas that you specifically already brought up? Yes. Methane and greenhouse gas.
And I showed you that data and you rejected it.
So let me finish. I didn't reject the data. I looked at the data and said, that doesn't look like it was outrageously bad. In fact, he leaves office and it's lower than when he entered office. And you said, yeah, but COVID. And I said, yeah, but that doesn't seem to really explain anything. Everything. We could see that it was already on a downward trend. And the downward trend between 2018 and 2019, well before COVID, seemed to be greater than the downward trend between 2019 and 2020. Let me finish my point, please. So what this seems to show is it wasn't the disaster that you suggested. For example, if we would see a similar trend line in this 4 years of Trump when it came to methane emissions specifically, we would see a marginal increase in his first and second year, followed by a precipitous loss in his third and fourth year.
Did we really need the example?
Let me finish.
We didn't need the example. Just make your point, man.
What do you mean? The point is you would look at that data and say, oh my God, this was a disaster. When I think we could all see that's not the case.
You remember the very first point that I brought up when you very first brought this up? Do you remember what that point was? Where I said when you were looking at the total emissions, which you are trying to do, it is not informative because those numbers are so multivariate that you can't disentangle them and contribute any increase or decrease to one individual person, okay?
Well, that
so
seems.
What I'm doing is I'm looking at the specific regulations that Trump rolled back and looking at how that affects greenhouse emissions with those regulations in place versus not having those regulations in place. I showed you those numbers and you rejected those numbers. That data you rejected because you said, oh, okay, that's not real data. That's just that's just speculation from scientists. That's not real.
Okay, so just
focus on just these one particular year comparisons because you're cherry picking the data to try to construct your narrative.
Okay, so just to be clear, that if those estimates would end up being off, even by 1%, you would eat crow. And you would say, my God, I was wrong. This wasn't data. It was an estimate. That's what you would say, correct? I was wrong. I'm sorry. We were talking about actual data that could be measured, and I brought up estimates that I falsely said was data. Mm-hmm. That's what you would say if those numbers ended up being incorrect, correct?
Not if they were incorrect by 1%, but if they were incorrect by like a significant portion that was outside of the margin of error of the estimate, then yeah, I would.
Let me ask you this, and I have much more to say on this specifically, which I'm assuming you won't have a problem with since this is your area of expertise. Did Biden's team immediately roll back the policies that Trump's EPA put in?
Some of them, yeah. They've rolled back a lot of them.
So you think that the EPA under Trump did very poorly. How would you rate it under Biden?
Better for sure, but I mean, it's a mixed bag. They're doing what they can, but they're also beholden to corporate interests.
Okay, so can you give me some of the regulations that they re-put back in that Trump's EPA rolled out? And
Yeah.
can you tell me roughly like what year those was?
Example was
Sure.
about methane leaks from oil infrastructure. So like basically in the pipes that transport gas, there were like huge methane leaks coming out of that. And so the EPA put in regulations that were specifically to monitor those leaks and reduce the methane that's leaking out of that equipment. And it reduced it by like a significant percentage.
So Trump rolled that back. Trump's EPA
That
rolled
was never in place. The Biden EPA put those regulations in place.
Okay,
Like
so my question...
there were specific regulations about methane emissions, not the same ones that Biden's EPA put in place.
Okay.
But there were methane emission regulations that Trump's administration did roll back.
Okay, so just to be clear, so you can't give me an example of one that Trump rolled back that Biden reinstituted. You're giving me a specific one that Biden instituted that had never been done before, and you're saying that's good.
Okay, there's one specifically about waste disposal for coal plants that Trump's EPA rolled back that then had negative health impacts on Americans that then Biden then put back in. I don't know the exact order.
Yeah, you don't have to give me the name or anything, but you understand my position. If your argument's like, there's all these things that protected us here, Trump's team comes in and removes these things, then Biden's team comes in and says, no, let's put those back in. And there's a reason I asked this specifically because
that has happened.
Okay, I'm not listen.
Waste disposal.
Okay, great. I'm not asking for like the specific date, the specific name of the bill, none of that shit. I'm asking you as someone that is unaware of these specific legislation. I'm willing to take your word for it. But the reason this is going to matter is if we go back and look at that estimate, can you put that back up? The estimate data?
Yeah, let me find it. Sharing the screen. Okay, here's their figure number 2 with the estimate.
Okay, so now what I'm seeing here is...
And they have kind of really terrible font colors, but their
Yeah,
total, when you add it all up, is 209 million metric tons of CO2.
But when is this? Data is based on 2025 estimates. So when was this specifically taken? 2018? Data is based on 2018 estimated reductions. Wait a minute. Go back to the top. Slide up a little. What is this even measuring? Estimated foregone. So what this is saying is that in 2018 there were regulations that were rolled back by you. I'm just going to say this. You tell me if I'm reading this wrong. Okay. There were regulations that from 2017 to 2018, when this study was done, that Trump's EPA rolled back, and so they're now doing this estimate of this is how many emissions we think by the year 2025 will be increased because of these regulations that were rolled back. Is that correct? Okay, so for example, with clean cars, this is not methane, by the way. This is just CO2, right?
This is CO2 or CO2 equivalents, I think. So.
Okay, so then my question is, how many did they predict, since this data was in 2018, and we can see that this is suggesting this is what it'll look like by 2025?
If you're asking me to fact check this data based on the data that we have up to this point, I don't have that analysis ready to go for you right now live, but I think it would be a fun exercise that we could maybe do after this, and then we could post the results. But I don't know.
I think that would be
something live right now.
I think that would be something to be interested to look at to get an idea for the accuracy of this. Because if you can't give me, for example, regulations on clean cars that Trump rolled back, if Biden never reinstituted them, then we would have an apples-to-apples comparison to see how correct this estimate would have been. Does it look like that there's been a spike in these emissions, even during the Biden administration? Do you think that it looks like that?
I think that comparatively that we did see a spike in these emissions, but you're right. After the pandemic, those have started to trend down because obviously there was a huge disruption in human activity during the pandemic that is going to mess up with our emissions numbers. So
but many times people say oftentimes that actually, particularly with fossil fuels and things like that, that there was an increase of use once the lockdown sort of ended. So if anything, although you're right that we would have seen a glut of those in 2021, maybe going into 2022, surely now in 2022, 2023, those numbers would be equal or higher than the normal usage of things like automobiles, electricity, etc.
I think that we might be getting lost in the weeds a little bit. I just want to make my overarching point with this is that Trump, who has said before that he thinks climate change is a hoax, is not going to be good for addressing climate change that we face.
Okay, so that's very unscientific what you're doing now. I love this. You're someone who should be an expert on these charts and the data, right? And you're the one making the affirmative claim. Trump will be a disaster for the environment. And I'm like, well, let's look at his previous term. And you're like, yes, it was a disaster because of these things at the EPA. We look at the specific data. The data seems to show that net, he was better than Obama, and that he left just with methane emissions.
I don't think that's what the data shows.
Okay, go back to the methane
data, because again,
go back to the methane.
Go
back to the methane chart.
The data that you want to quote is too multivariate to be drawing the types of conclusions that you're trying to draw from it. I keep making that point, and you keep doing it anyway, Rob.
No, that's incorrect. So what you're doing is you're conflating two things, right? And I'll answer the multivariate thing as well. When we're talking about the way things are, right? What does the data say? I am correct when I make the statement that net, it was lower on average under Trump than it was under Biden or Obama, correct? Yes or no?
In terms of the total absolute value of greenhouse gas
correct.
emissions, I believe that is correct.
Okay, and methane, correct?
I think in total, for all across the board, but I think again that is just going off of global trends, that a lot of the things were put in place by the Obama administration, like the Paris Climate Accords that he got us into. And by the way, I'm not a fan of Obama either, so
okay, it doesn't matter if you're a fan or not.
So I just want to make sure that that point is said, because I'm not just saying that because I'm an Obama fan. Like, I'm not a big Obama fan, and I'm still saying that.
But what we're saying, it seems just you're suggesting there's something uniquely bad with Trump running the EPA, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so then I think it would be fair to compare to other presidents around Trump. That seems reasonable, even if you weren't the biggest fan of them. If you're saying that this is a unique threat, right? Yeah. So this isn't the way things are normally done, which will be uniquely bad, right? So what I'm saying is, when we look at the actual data, we could see that those things were better under Trump on average than they were under Obama.
No.
Yes. Go to the methane.
Better now. You're changing it, right?
Bring up the methane chart.
Earlier we said absolute values, and now you're just saying it's better or worse. When you're you're not looking at percent change, increase, overall trends. You're only looking at this absolute value and then making a statement like better or worse. Which
bring up the methane chart.
You can
bring up the methane chart.
I might have closed out of the methane chart. I'll try to pull up a.
Okay.
I'll try to find another chart here. But
why don't we look at the same chart we were looking at?
Look at the trends of, is it going up? Is it going down? I think that the data that you're trying to use is insufficient for the conclusions you're trying to draw from it. That's my issue.
I mean, I'm looking at a chart right now. It shows U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by major emitting sector from 2005 to 2023. Yeah, can I do that? Let's see if I can figure that out.
It's at the bottom.
I don't use StreamYard.
It's at the bottom where it says present with a little plus.
Here we go. Sometimes this happens to me. I lose my mouse cursor. I don't know if you ever had that happen. Let's see if I can find.
That's okay.
Present.
Then, I did eventually maybe want to get on to the other subjects, like with the human rights or foreign policy.
Oh, well, this is great stuff.
I agree, but yeah, I mean, we don't have all night, you know. Okay.
Okay. Here we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, do you see that it looks like from 2005 to 2023? It looks like, with the exception of the transportation sector, which is pretty flatlined, goes up just a little under Trump. All these other industries, it seems to be either flatlined or going down, such as the power industry, which we can see went down significantly. It looks under the Trump years, right? So the point I'm trying to make is, net, it seems like all of these emissions were lower under the Trump years. Now, okay, can I stop sharing screen? Are you cool with that?
Do you think that it could have to do with the fact that under the Obama years, they started ramping up solar and wind capacity in the country that only then came online during the Trump years when he wasn't in a position to stop it?
Well, so let me finish, right? So first, to answer this point specifically on multivariance, it would seem to suggest if there are all these external factors that mean that the specific policies of the EPA, we can't look at just the net numbers. That's what you're suggesting, right? We can't look at the actual data, right? Because there's all these other variants that could suggest why the data did what it did. I'm
not saying don't look at the data. I'm just saying don't look at the final top of the line total number, because that's too multivariate.
Okay, so if the point is, and so the argument would be, it's not just what's being regulated at the EPA. There could be all sorts of other factors. For example, here could be a factor, just general, without government intervention whatsoever, increased in technology. So maybe some university somewhere gets a better solar technology or better tidal technology, whatever. All of these things could exist as externalities outside of EPA regulations, correct?
Yeah, and also on that point, did you hear about the innovation in nuclear fusion that happened a couple years ago? The first time that they ever got more power out than they put in. It's really funny how that happened because that program was shut down under the Trump administration because he took away their funding, and they were only able to start trial runs again during the Biden administration when their funding was restored so that they can then turn on their nuclear fusion machine, which they couldn't even turn on under Trump because he took away their funding for scientific innovations.
Okay, so anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that if you say that we can't just look at the actual, or that it's not the end all be all to just look at the actual raw numbers of how much emissions declined, because they did decline under Trump. And in fact, in some ways, it seems that they declined at a rate that was similar or better than Obama, that they were declining
Not
under.
borne out by the data.
Okay, can we go back to that methane chart?
I'll find it again, Rob. I know you like the methane chart. I'll go find it.
Well, it seems like the trend of those last 2 years was more precipitously going down than
I
any
don't.
point.
It literally changed from 7. It was like 1 point. If you actually crunch the numbers, what you just said is not accurate. But I will try to find this chart that I just had. Let me go to my recently closed tabs.
It seems similar to during the Obama years.
I don't think that the actual data bears that out when you look at a percentage change. Here we go.
So we can
I'm
see
pulling it back up again.
Sure.
Here we go. Okay. So you've got Obama here. And again, the entire stream at this point is just a debate on this chart. But okay, it's 875 at the start of Obama, and then it drops down to 796 or
so it goes like 80. Yeah,
I'll
give you, it looks better.
Under Trump, it's 796 to 795.
Okay, so you're right that it went down more under the Obama years than Trump, but the rate of the last 2 years looks like it was similar, if not better, than the average rate during the Obama years, though it does particularly seem like, I don't know, what was going on in 2010 to 11?
This
Seems
is also
like there was
a great point. Do you understand the concept of lagging indicators?
So that would be that, correct me if I'm wrong, that oftentimes the policies we see, we don't see the net effects of till a couple years later or a year.
Exactly. So yeah, you do understand the concept.
That's a great point for me. How are
here?
things looking? How are things looking under those Biden years with the lagging indicators of policies we saw under Trump? Oh, they're declining even more. So when we first see, so if it's a great point. It's great.
No,
so why don't we go
Rob,
to?
I don't think that you're being honest here because you know that Biden also passed some of the most progressive climate legislation of any president ever. So like,
what's the point? The point we're trying to make here isn't what policies Biden passed. We're saying that the policies that were instituted or the regulations that were rolled back when Trump was there was a disaster for, in this case, methane emissions, right? And so what we see is the worst years for Trump was his first year and his second year. When you bring up lagging indicators, how much effect would his policies have had year one? It seems more likely that that would be a lagging indicator, which you just said. Don't you understand lagging indicators? Wouldn't that seem to be that the policies from 2016 that would have been instituted under Obama would have more effect on the indicators of raw numbers in 2017?
But Rob, you would understand that that would be dependent on the policy. Some policies are going to have immediate effects, and other policies are not. Surely we can agree about that, right? If you have a policy that just instantly cuts methane emissions because it changes the type of fitting between your pipes, that's going to have an immediate impact, and it's going to have a long-term impact, right? There's going to be different time frames, and we should all
how convenient. How convenient from the perspective of someone that says, let's look at the raw data. Oh, don't you understand about lagging indicators? You would surely realize that many of the policies that Trump rolled back, would you agree with this? Let's say Trump rolls back a policy on car emissions, vehicle emissions, okay? You got that? Or on power plant emissions, whatever. He rolls back a regulation on one of those. Chances are you wouldn't see the effects of that for a year or two, correct? It's not going to be immediate because even if once the law changes, it's going to take some time for the specific power plants or the specific vehicle manufacturers to change how they're manufacturing vehicles, correct?
Yeah, or like what he specifically rolled back about those coal plants dumping in local streams. That's going to take a while for those toxic chemicals to start building up to harmful levels. So that's going to start having an effect down the line, not immediately.
Okay. So what did you say, like 2 years it would take before we really start to see an
I don't
impact?
know. I wouldn't be able to give you numbers like
But you would agree that it's going to be some length of time. It's not going to be like the next day.
Sure.
It wouldn't be fair for me to go test those levels 2 days after the rollback and say, see, no change. That would be horseshit.
Yeah.
We both agree with that. So then the problem is this lagging indicator thing's actually going to be worse for you because what it shows is the worst years of Trump were the first 2 years. And then we can see that once they would have started rolling back regulations year 1, year 2, that we would most likely not see the effects of those until Trump like year 3, year 4, which we could see that there was a precipitous decline. And we would also expect to see the policies that Trump instituted year 3 and year 4 then show up during the Biden administration. Like, even if he re-put those regulations in, you would still not expect those regulations to have an immediate effect on emissions because it would take these companies time to start complying with the regulations. Okay. So let me finish this point real quick.
Can you address the multivariate thing? Because that's going to be my response to everything that you just said, is that there's too many factors to conclude what you're concluding. So can you just address that part?
Yes. So I will address the multivariant thing. So then what you're saying is that because there are other factors, such as ones we talked about, there could be a breakthrough scientifically. It has nothing to do with Trump or his administration. Just some scientist somewhere in Kansas comes up with some great biofuel, right?
Probably not Kansas, but yeah.
You see what I'm saying? What is that? A little bigotry there? Little high ed bigotry? What's wrong with the fine scientists in Kansas? I find them to be fantastic people. Nonetheless.
They're great at mosasaur research, but not green energy alternatives.
Switchgrass? I knew a scientist from Kansas that was heavily invested in researching switchgrass.
That makes sense. They have a strong agricultural science program. I'm saying they're good in certain areas. They're not great at green energy.
So when I say biofuel, it would be entirely reasonable that it's someone working in agriculture like Kansas that might be able to have a breakthrough in that, correct?
Okay, Rob. If you want to dig it into my snide remarks, you can.
I'm just fucking with you, but I'm saying I find the state I picked to be entirely reasonable with the specific thing that I said. Nonetheless.
I mean, Rob, I literally went to the University of Oklahoma, so I know that good science is done in rural red states, okay? I get it.
Okay, so point being, right, when talking specifically about this, there are other factors, so we wouldn't be able to just look at the raw data. My point to you would be, it seems then when you're admitting that looking at the raw data and how it went down under Trump, we can't really use that much because of multivariants. What that seems to suggest to me is that these EPA regulations aren't that important. Because if you're saying that, if you're saying that it was such a disaster under Trump, and yet the data doesn't bear that out, the data suggests, despite what you would have said at the time, each of these specific regulation rollbacks, I can imagine if me and you have like a weekly show, you would be like, holy shit, this is going to be a disaster. Wait until you see a year or two from now. You're going to see these emissions skyrocket. But then we didn't. And when we don't, you're like, well, that's because there's other factors at play. And so it wasn't just this regulation. Okay, then it seems to suggest that you saying that Trump's going to be a unique threat because, oh my goodness, he's going to appoint someone to the EPA that'll roll back regulations seems to not bear out to be true for the very reason that you're giving. Because it's only a small part and there's multivariants. And so therefore we'll still be safe, just like we were in the first 4 years under Trump, where we saw actually emissions decreased.
This is a very interesting rhetorical strategy, but I just don't think that it actually makes logical sense if you think about it even a little bit, right? Because just look at any one of these regulations and what specifically they are rolling back. It cannot be argued that this does not lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions.
Show me. Give me a specific one that Trump did that led to methane emissions being disastrously increased.
Okay, we've actually got some people in the chat that have been posting tons of them. Cool.
Read like 5 and just now listen. Just read the name of them and the year that they were implemented.
Okay.
Sure.
Trump rolled back most of the requirements of a 2017 rule aimed at improving safety at sites that use hazardous chemicals that was instituted after a chemical plant exploded in Texas, one.
2017,
you can also see Trump changed safety rules that allow for rail transport of highly flammable liquefied natural gases.
2, got it.
How
many you got?
Overturning a ban on the use of lead ammunition and fishing tackle on federal lands.
Cool.
We've got weakening a rule aimed to limit toxic discharge from power plants into public waterways.
4.
We've got lifting a Clinton-era ban on logging and road construction in the Tongass in Alaska. So that's a huge carbon sink.
Gotcha. 5. You can keep going if you want. We'll do them all.
Trump withdrew a requirement that Gulf oil rig owners prove that they can cover the cost of removing rigs once they stop producing. I mean,
Cool.
are you going to seriously try to make the case that these regulation rollbacks are not resulting in an increased amount of greenhouse gas emissions?
I'm saying despite those rollbacks, we have not seen a drastic increase in emissions that would be a disaster for this country or the world, as you claimed would happen. We don't. Let me finish. We don't have to guess. You just outlined quite a few things.
I didn't claim. By the way, I did not claim what you just said. I claimed.
Okay, then what's your claim? Why would it be such a disaster?
Okay, right. So I want to make this clear because I made this point initially. I thought you understood it, but now I'm not so sure of that, right? Because without rolling back these regulations, say we drop 100 points of greenhouse gas emissions. I'm making up the units. I'm making up the number.
No problem.
Now,
I get what you're
say
saying.
that we roll back those regulations and we only drop 80 points.
Gotcha.
Right? So you see, that's the comparison. In both cases, greenhouse gas emissions dropped. So your argument applies in both cases. My argument, though, is that they dropped more when we still had those regulations in place, which is better.
That's not what your argument was.
And let me explain. When I showed you, remember that 200 number that I showed you? That is the argument.
That's not the argument, and I'll explain to you why that wasn't your argument. Because your argument wasn't that Trump's team will do good but less good. Your argument was that Trump's team would be a disaster and that it was a disaster the first time. That would imply that it's making the situation worse, not making the situation better more slowly.
That is worse.
That's not worse.
I disagree with your framing here because the argument that you're saying I'm not making is the argument that I've been making this entire time. That's what that 200 number, that was the only initial number that I quoted to you. That's what that 200 number represents, is that difference between 80 and 20. That's the number that I gave you.
Okay, so
That's always been my argument this entire time. And I'm saying that it's not just that it's less good. It is bad. It is a disaster to reduce it by less.
Okay, so I just want to be clear. When you suggest that Trump's term this time could be a disaster, like the way you would quantify a disaster is even if emissions decrease, they could have decreased more if we had a different president. That's your argument?
That was exactly my argument.
Okay,
yes.
Well then I would suggest that the way you define disaster is completely erroneous because that wouldn't be a disaster. That is still gradual improvement that would be good, and the idea that somehow there's going to be this tipping point if we only decrease things 20% instead of 20 units instead of 80 units, and that's going to lead to these unmitigated disasters is unwarranted. It's not true.
So here's what the disaster is, right? The disaster is climate change, okay? Mm-hmm. Like, we're barreling towards that future.
I don't believe that.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, but you got to explain stratospheric cooling then.
Sure.
If you can't, I don't know, because I'm not aware of any other explanation for stratospheric cooling other than the greenhouse gas effect.
Okay, so it's not. So let me explain what happens with climate change, right? There is a consensus that the climate is changing. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
There is a consensus. Now, the term consensus is weird. When I say it, I'm saying like 95% of the people that study this stuff agree. Is that fair? I don't mean 100%. You could obviously find one person.
Yes.
So when I say consensus, I'm not trying to be a dick about it, right? So there's also a consensus that humans have something to do with climate change, correct?
Yeah.
You would agree with that. That's basically where the consensus ends. Like, for example, let me ask you this. By what point would we reach if emissions continue at a trend that we're expecting right now, at what point would we be beyond the point of no return? Is there a consensus?
That there would never be a consensus on that because you could always have some sort of technology that reverses it in the future. Like,
absolutely true. Actually, you've made the greatest point why these models suck because they never understand human ingenuity, right? For example,
yeah, but that's not something to bank on. I'm not just going to bank on technology.
Let me explain this. So, for example, when I was debating in 2003, 2004 in college, one of the topics one year was the United States should sign on to one of these treaties. One of the treaties was called the Kyoto Protocol. Did you ever hear of this?
I have.
The Kyoto Protocol said that all the signees would reduce emissions by 20% by the year 2020. Right? Does that sound familiar? Something like that. I think I'm getting the specifics on that right. The United States did not sign the Kyoto Protocol. It was very similar. It was sort of the beginning of a Paris Climate Accord type agreement, right? And yet, despite the fact that we didn't sign that, would you be shocked to know that the United States did, in fact, reduce their emissions 20% by the year 2020? without signing it. Now, I was told, and people were reading credible evidence from scientists that said, without signing this accord and then instituting drastic policies to punish fossil fuels and completely curb the amount of fossil fuels, we'll never make this emission reduction, and that would be a disaster for the planet. And it turned out they were absolutely incorrect, because what they didn't take into effect was we didn't immediately need to collapse our economy by having something like a 40% reduction in fossil fuel usage. Instead, we were able to gradually, through ingenuity and other policies, ensure that we had a gradual change that met the goals that they were suggesting without having a disastrous effect to the economy. The people that talk about these radical things, like, oh, we need to radically curb fossil fuel emissions, etc., all of these policies would directly harm the lowest class people, particularly in a country like the United States.
I don't really think you can be talking about that based on...
Absolutely I can. Why not? For example, if we all
His
pay...
policies would directly harm all of the
That's not true. For example, let's say, for example, that we say that we're going to limit the consumption of fossil fuels in this country by 20%.
Yes.
That would lead to an increase in prices of energy. So just
If
say,
it was
like,
indiscriminate, sure, or it could be targeted.
so how would you target that? So, for example, we say all coal
You
plants
change
now...
the regulations surrounding private jet travel.
So your argument is the coal plant, where the vast bulk of our energy is coming from, you wouldn't do anything to change them. You would just change regulations.
Is not coming from coal.
Where's the bulk of our energy coming from?
I mean, in terms of a single source, probably oil, but it's not coal.
For like electricity?
Yeah.
Let me look this up.
Sure, you can. I don't really think it's very pertinent, but like the point overall that you're trying to make is such that poor people will be the most adversely affected by overall energy reduction, like energy use reductions, which I agree with. Like, I'm not saying that like, you just indiscriminately stop the total amount of energy use. Like, you can regulate it so that people that are unnecessarily burning energy for things like flying to a Taylor Swift concert or something can be regulated.
No, wait, I'm just curious, right? Yeah. Because you're making declarative claims. So far, I caught you in... Perhaps it was a misunderstanding on my part, but the idea when I asked you specifically if these emissions dropped under Trump, you said no, and then you were like, well, you were talking about estimates. So as someone who researches this heavily, do you have any idea where what leads to the majority of our electricity production?
You're telling me that it's coal?
No, I'm asking you specifically. I was guessing that it's coal. It's not. It wasn't until 2016. Gas? It is natural gas, but you didn't know that.
All right, that makes sense to me.
It seems odd that someone with your expertise seems to be pretty vague about specifics on these.
My expertise is not in energy production.
Okay, nonetheless, the point is that if you were going to have...
Rob, just FYI, my expertise is in biochemistry, just so you know.
Well, I mean your expertise in what you claim to be debating. It seems like you've debated sort of climate change quite frequently.
I have one climate change debate on my channel.
Fair enough. I misunderstood.
Most of it is against young Earth creationism. I argue about evolution, the Big Bang, abiogenesis. I argue against flat earthers with physics and relativity. That kind of thing is my typical wheelhouse.
Okay, so the point is, right, yes, what would happen would be, it's no one suggesting just regulate. For example, the regulations that Trump rolled back that you seem to have a problem with, none of them were regulations specifically on private jet usage. Like you were the ones you read were talking about transportation of energy.
They don't go far enough in terms of the regulations for me. I got you.
But the point I'm trying to make is, oftentimes with these regulations are no one's suggesting, oh, we're just going to limit private jet usage. That's it. That's our policy. That's not what the Democrats in Congress that are suggesting.
You're trying to say that these economic regulations have a disproportionate negative impact on the poorest Americans.
Yes, you disagree?
Again, I think that some do and some don't. It depends on your targeting, and you can have regulations that do have meaningful impact that don't have a disproportionate effect on poor people that are targeted. That was my point when I brought up private jet regulations.
Okay, so Biden's team instituted specific regulations, correct? That you were a fan of. Can you give me an example of one of them that was only targeted to the wealthy?
I'm not sure which ones I'd be able to bring up. I think most of them were specifically targeted at the fossil fuel industry.
Right. And the cheap energy, including from things in fossil fuels like natural gas, oil, etc., that affects poor people more than it does wealthy people. Let me give you an example. Stephen Colbert famously said, I don't care if gasoline goes $15 to a gallon. Of course he doesn't care. But my neighbors that live paycheck to paycheck, they can't afford that. So the problem is, it's the same problem with inflation. Like, no matter how rich you get, unless you're talking about private jets, you're only going to drive so much. You're only going to pay.
Why don't we talk about Trump's pro-inflationary policies?
Well, we could move on to that at some point if you want, but I just want to make clear, I don't think you've done a sufficient job at showing why, when it comes to regulations, particularly from the EPA, that it's going to lead to a grotesque increase in emissions that would be a disaster. And I feel that I've even got you to admit that that's not what you're suggesting. You're suggesting that it would lead to a slower decline in emissions. You're also suggesting
when I say increase in emissions and when you say increase emissions, I think we're being too ambiguous. When I say increase in emissions, the comparison, the baseline that I'm comparing to is a world without Trump doing these things. The baseline that you're comparing to is the start of Trump's presidency. We have different baselines of comparison. When we say increase, it means increase relative to what?
Right. So relative to what we see that has occurred.
So I'm saying increase relative to a world without Trump being president.
But you have no way of knowing that. You're guessing what it would be with Trump without president.
You can calculate the impacts of these regulations, what effects they will have.
But we could see that under a Trump term, the first term that you're saying was a disaster, that he was less than the previous.
What argument have I been making against this all night that you have still not?
That it's multivariant, which shows that the specific policies that a president or the EPA illustrates isn't the end-all be-all. That there were other things that happened that ended up lowering emissions.
Sure, yeah, but I feel like you're using that to try to minimize the effect that these things have. Just because there are multiple variables that are contributing to a final outcome doesn't mean that changing one or two variables won't have an impact or isn't important.
But it didn't have an impact on the raw data that we were seeing. It actually still led to a decline in emissions. You don't
know that, Rob.
No, we do know that.
No, you don't.
Yes, we do.
You are claiming that it didn't have an impact on the raw data we were seeing, but you are not comparing. The basis that you're comparing to is not a valid control in any scientific
That's outrageous. We could see, like, if I could see that 10,000, what's the unit that they used again? I forget this.
1 million metric tons.
10 million metric tons on average were there under Obama, and under Trump it was 9.9 million metric tons that were put in on average a year. I could say there is data that I'm looking at that shows that there was a decrease. The speed at which we were emitting decreased. Yeah, you're saying
use data to lie if you want.
It's not lying. That's true.
Okay. But
that's true.
You have to disentangle the causative factors behind the data.
That's not true.
Hey, what if it was a policy that was in place 5 years beforehand that's responsible?
But listen, the problem is, and it's someone. Do you have a degree in science?
Yes.
Okay, so you understand this. Data exists. Right? You could objectively see raw data. We could argue as to what influenced that data. Correct?
Sure, yeah.
So as a scientist,
the underlying
as a scientist, we could look at something like a specific person and their cholesterol levels. Mm-hmm. And you could say, you came in this month and this is what your cholesterol was. And then the next month you came in and your cholesterol was increased. So me and you as two scientists could look at that and say, that's a truth. We can see that cholesterol increased. We may disagree as to why.
Yeah.
We might say, well, here's the factors that I think led, and you would say,
we agree on this point, Rob.
Right. So the point I'm trying to say is I'm looking at the actual data, which to me is what matters most. Not hypothetical if we guess what it would have been if Trump's not there. Not, oh, you're lying because while the data says that, I disagree as to how much Trump's policies had to do with that.
The causes of the data.
No, I completely disagree. When discussing the outcome at the end of the day of what this data will mean for our world, for our country.
If I showed you data that showed that there were more sunny days under a Biden administration, there were more rainy days under a Trump administration. And I'm just saying, hey, I'm just looking at the data, man. The causes behind that data don't matter at all. I'm just saying, if you like sunny weather, vote for Biden. You would understand that that's a terrible, nonsensical analysis.
No, and I'll explain
what we're doing.
No, I'll explain what you're doing and why your argument's nonsensical. My argument to that would be, but wait a minute. There's multivariance in why there'd be sunny days or rainy days, right? And it's absurd to say that Biden's policies led to that. You would agree with that, right?
Yeah, it's not just Biden's policies that make in the weather.
Right. And so then I would expect you to then finish the argument by saying, oh, well then, Rob, when you said Biden's so bad because of rainy days, that was bullshit because it turned out his policies weren't the end all be all of that because there's so much multivariance. Yes, that would be correct. That's the exact position we're arguing here in the inverse. You're saying that Trump would be such a disaster. But the outcome that matters is what will these emissions look like? That's what we're concerned with. When we say, well, why would emissions be bad? What we're suggesting isn't the reasons that the emissions go up or down. What we're saying is, at the end of the day, if emissions are at this level, bad shit will happen. Okay. And so when we look and we see that those emissions are decreasing under what you called a disastrous presidency, and then when you say, well, that's because of other factors, hypothetically,
Rob, hold on, man.
Well, let me finish real quick. One, you don't know what all those other factors are, and you're going to look at it with rose-colored glasses saying, well, my side always does better than your side. And secondly, then it seems to suggest that because there's so much multivariance, that the EPA decisions under Trump weren't such a disaster.
Right. You made that point. Okay, look, the reason why you extending my analogy makes it no longer analogous in the way that you're trying to use it is because we can both agree that there are policies of a presidential administration that do absolutely have an effect on greenhouse gas emissions. We can both agree that there are policies that are going to have an effect, but we don't agree that there are going to be policies of a U.S. president that are going to affect the number of sunny or rainy days, right? So
that's not true. There could be.
Like what, man?
Cloud seeding.
Okay. So then there you go. Then I would no longer, then if you want to go with that, then your analogy would be analogous again. Then we could say, oh, well, look, if your argument was that Trump is bad because of the more rainy days, and I could point to policies of cloud seeding showing that is the case, like I can with rollbacks of EPA protections increasing greenhouse gas emissions, which I showed you in that report, which you rejected.
That's not what that report said.
The 200 million.
That's not what it said. You
numbers.
Just misspoke. It did not say there would be an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. It said that there would be
compared to not. That means
there would be a loss of decrease.
Okay. When I say increase, I'm talking about that 100 versus 80.
Well, that's an inaccurate term. What you mean is a loss of decrease.
To me, that's an increase because it's an increase relative to the other case.
But that's not how normal people speak. If you say greenhouse gas,
very normal language, Rob.
That's not true. If I asked 100 people, if I said the phrase greenhouse gas emissions increased under Trump, do you think they would interpret that as A, the amount went up when Trump was in office than compared to before, or do you think they would think B, well, the amount in total went down, but they went up compared to what it would have been if Trump wasn't in office? What do you think the average person would think?
I don't know, but here's the
thing.
You know.
Don't be disingenuous. You know what they
I really don't, actually.
So I just want to be... No, wait. This is a greater point.
Talk, Rob. Come on now. I'm saying that if next week I owe $100 and then somebody helps me out so that next week I only owe $80, then my total net worth went up $20. That's a $20 increase. That's the way I'm thinking about this.
That's not analogous at all what we're talking about.
That's the way I think about finance. That's the way
you don't think that you're being disingenuous when if I went to someone and said, hey, greenhouse gas emissions increased under Trump, that 99 out of 100 of them would think, oh, that means there were more greenhouse gas emissions under Trump than before him. You don't think that's what they'd think? They would, in their head, go, oh, that probably means that greenhouse gas emissions went down, but it went up compared to what I think it would have been had Trump not been in office. That's what you think most people would think?
I think
that's
it's
absurd.
To be honest, I think it's
absurd. It's an absurd argument, and I think it goes to show bias that you have.
Are increasing by 200 million metric tons. It doesn't matter whether that 200 million metric tons is being added on top or is being subtracted from a further reduction. It's a net increase of 200 million metric tons. Either way you cut it. I really think that we are so deep into the weeds now, and we've gone so off the deep rails that we've spent an hour and a half on one of my 3 points, and we haven't gotten to any of the human rights
We
violations.
could move on if you want. If you want to put a bow on this, we could both give closing statements on this. We'll move on to the next thing. Totally fine with that.
I mean, yeah, I would like to move on because we've.
You want to give a minute closing statement?
On the
you want to give a minute closing statement on this, or do you want me to go first, or do you not want to do closing statement on? What do you think? I would like to give a minute closing statement. I don't really care about
closing statements. If you want to have one,
I'll take a minute closing statement, then we can move on. Then, if that's suffice to you.
If you have a minute, I'll have a minute after you.
You want to go second? That's smart. Got it. Okay, so it's clear to see the idea that this would be a disaster. What we're concerned about when it comes to emissions specifically is what those raw data of emissions would be. Not that, we could have reduced it more hypothetically, says a bunch of partisan people that don't like Trump and don't like these regulations in the first place, had they not been rolled back. He admitted that he thought the 2016 Trump administration was a disaster when it came to emissions, but compared to the data, we saw that there was actually a net decrease in the amount that we are putting out every year. It wasn't the disaster they claimed. He makes mistakes by talking about sort of the lag that would occur with this data, but we could see that actually the worst years under Trump would have been the lag years from Obama, and we can see that they precipitously went down from 2018, even before COVID. Things weren't that bad, and the idea that this would be such a disaster is a joke. The climate change people do this all the time. It's not that they're not correct that there is climate change, it's that they make it this hyperbolic, apocalyptic scenario, and the policies always would screw over poor and working class people, such as those that we see in institutions like, or plans like the Green New Deal. So he hasn't made his case whatsoever. He's done a very poor job. He's tried to have duplicitous language that said, when I talk about increase, I mean if Trump wasn't there and the estimates of what that hypothetically could have been. The truth is it wasn't that bad under Trump. Emissions still went down. It's likely that we'll roll back burdensome regulations this time that will be a boon to the economy. There is multivariance, which means that there will still be technological advancements, which will continue to lead to the reductions of these emissions, which means the disastrous effects that we've told the apocalyptic scenarios of climate change aren't going to happen, and we'll have more economic viability as opposed to burdensome regulations that disproportionately hurt the poor and working class.
Okay, so I think that this was a very good case study in the kind of arrogance of the average Trump supporter, right? Because Rob started this by talking about how, casting doubts about whether the experts really are the experts. He was saying, if somebody is an expert, they're probably just grown up in this sort of propaganda mill of academia or whatever. You can't trust what they're saying. He started by casting aspersions and doubts on the expertise of experts. And I think that this is incredibly emblematic of the kind of science denial that we typically see in the MAGA movement, because after saying this, Rob looks at one chart and then thinks that he is capable of understanding all the nuance of this chart. I see that he picked up on a word I might have introduced to his vocabulary, multivariate. Fun shout out in your conclusion there, adding that you almost used it, right? And then just the icing on the cake was the fact that he thinks that now he has looked at the data himself. He has drawn logical and informed conclusions from this data that he thinks that he is confident enough that he can draw his own conclusions and that they would be well-informed and substantiated. He's not missing anything. There's nothing he's left out. There's no nuance or any confounding factors that he's not accounting for. He's looked at the data. He's concluded that he's right. The experts are simply ideologically captured. The experts are not looking at the data. He's looking at the data. Anything that the experts come out with, that's all just speculation. That's not borne out in the data. And it just speaks to the kind of overconfidence, arrogance, the skepticism towards expertise, and the overall air of pseudoscience that I see so often on the right, especially in regards to climate change, vaccine science, etc.
Hey, you know what? I'll concede totally. I don't know exactly what they were talking about. Can you go ahead and explain exactly what they were talking about? These experts, go ahead. That estimate, the one chart that you put out.
Yeah.
You're saying that I'm arrogantly saying I could read the chart. You're absolutely right. I don't know specifically what they were talking about. Can you articulate it?
The chart I was specifically talking about in making that statement was with those methane emissions charts where you're saying, oh, well, the lagging indicators would actually be from Obama's year. Correct. Pull that from your ass. You also were talking about, oh, well, the lagging indicators apply here and not here. You don't.
No, that's what you did. That's what you did.
No, I did not.
Yes, you brought up the point when I was talking about when we look at the raw data, we can see that it decreased. It was lower when Trump left office than when he came in. right? And you said, you smugly brought up someone from your chat that said, Rob doesn't even know about lagging indicators. And I said, is this what you mean by lagging indicators? That it would often take a year or two to see the results of policies?
Yeah.
And you said, yes. And I said, okay, well, given that, seeing as how the worst years under Trump were his first 2 years, which would be more likely to see residual lagging indicators from the Obama years, and then we see it go down for the last 2 years, and then the next 2 years under Biden, we continue to see it go down. It would suggest that lagging indicators would be a stronger case for Trump's policies not being that bad. And then you said, oh, no, because now it has to do with specific. So I'm asking you, give me the specific things that Trump did that wouldn't be lagging indicators versus the things that Obama did that would be lagging indicators and the things that Biden did that would be the opposite.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I already gave you examples in this talk, right? I gave you examples of things that would be rollbacks of regulations that would have a lagging indicator.
Give me an example of one of those.
I gave you others, such as the buildup of toxic waste in stream beds. That would be something that we would expect to have down-term lagging effects as those build up to threshold levels.
Okay, can you give me?
I gave you examples, Rob, of things that would have immediate effects. We've already been through this.
Like what? Give me one of those. I forget those examples.
And you just did exactly what I accused you of cherry picking the data. I never said that everything can be explained by lagging indicators. That is a position you are putting on me. All I asked you was if you are aware of the concept of lagging indicators.
Yes.
I did not say or imply that the data was strictly explained by lagging indicators.
Now, real quick, you said that you gave me examples of ones that would have lagging indicators. I agree. The 5 you showed seemed to, in my estimation of briefly looking at them, be ones that would have lagging indicators. You then said that you gave me examples of ones that would be immediate. Can you? I missed that. Can you tell me what those were?
Yeah. His rollbacks of methane emission regulations, where previously it was regulated how much methane emissions a company was allowed to release. Those were rolled back. That has an immediate impact of increasing methane emissions in like 2017, 2018.
So he immediately in 2017 said you could release more in methane.
Yeah.
And then these companies, that wouldn't be lagging. These companies immediately were like, great, we could completely change overnight how we do things. We can now. Yeah, I disagree. I think that would also have a lagging effect.
It can have both.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying is, you seem to be
wanting, not mutually exclusive.
You seem to be wanting to have your cake and eat it too.
Like I'm just trying to introduce nuance.
Of course, there's nuance. The problem is when we are looking at the raw data, we can see that actually there was a net decrease from when Trump came into office to when he came out. That's just looking at methane. I think the decrease was even more significant when it comes to greenhouse gas and carbon emissions in general. But nonetheless, you then start to institute all of these, but there's all these other variables and there's lagging indicators we have to accept, and there's nuance. And what it comes to is you don't have any specifics. You're just doing the same thing that you're accusing me of doing. And you're basically just having this appeal to, you are.
I'm not looking at the overall numbers. You're the one bringing up the totals. I'm looking at specifics. What will this specific rollback of legislation, how much even increase with a baseline of not having done that regulation, what is the increase in greenhouse gases? That is the initial number I sent you in that study using EPA data that you rejected, that you said was too speculative.
No, again, you don't.
We've been going on in circles.
You did not do that.
We both already gave our concluding statements, Rob. We already gave our concluding statements on this part.
That's fine. You didn't do that. I'll say this will be my last word. You didn't do that. You presented a chart that didn't give any specifics at all. It just said the shit that Trump did will lead to this by 2025. It didn't say, here's how much we expect year to year. It didn't say what those specific policies were. It just said, trust us, this is what it'll be. That's why I specifically asked you. I said
what specific policies they were.
Okay. What were they?
The Clean Power Plan is one of them. Like the safe vehicle rule draft. Like literally they did list the specific.
Okay. Did Biden reinstitute those regulations?
I don't know, Rob.
Okay, then how would we check for the accuracy of these predictions? Can you explain in your estimation, if we were trying to decide, we're almost at 2025, we only got a couple more months. So surely these numbers, if Biden didn't reinstitute this plan, they're going to be remarkably accurate, correct?
You can look at how much would an average car emit with these regulations in place versus without these regulations in place.
That's not true.
You can do this on a per car level.
That's not true. For example, could the automobile industry trend to having less emissions even if there wasn't a regulation demanding that?
Again, is how a scientific experiment is done, is that you have a control, Rob. We're saying all things equal, what is the difference between an individual car with this regulation in place versus without this regulation in place? There's a control done to eliminate other variables.
But you're incorrect, because what we're dealing with is an estimate. This is a projection. This isn't the same as looking at right, but that's not how science works. It's not
they calculate and estimate things in science.
Let me finish. It's not how science works that we says these scientists did a calculation. That's it. It's 100% accurate, guaranteed. They did a calculation. That's it. We can't question it now. And so if they say by 2025, this is how things will look, and then we look at 2025 and we go, no, it doesn't look like that at all. You would say, no, it has to. They did a calculation. What we would say is that calculation is... Please, let me finish. Calculations can be fallible.
You were going to make your last point, and now you're still making more points.
You keep making points to rebut, which I'm rebutting your points.
Right? You're supposed to give a concluding, and I was supposed to have the final conclusion. That's what we agreed to.
I understand the fact that you don't want to talk about this because you aren't able to defend this.
I wanted to have.
I want you to find, if you're right that these estimates were correct, we're almost at 2025. Find those numbers. Send them to me. Post them to your audience that show.
5 minutes ago, when we already agreed to that, Rob. We already.
I don't remember you saying I'm going to post these numbers to my channel or to you.
I said that we're going to figure out this and then we're going to post them. I agreed to that 45 minutes ago, Rob.
Okay, and just so you know, if they're wildly inaccurate, you're going to say, "My God, I used a bad estimate. The experts were wrong."
Wildly inaccurate, Rob. Okay, look. The reason why I'm trying to move the conversation on is not because I don't want to have a debate about climate change. It's because the debate we agreed about was to talk about Trump and if he's going to be good or bad. And I brought up 3 points I wanted to talk about. I thought we were going to talk about for maybe an hour and a half. We've already surpassed that, and we've only talked about 1 point. That's why I'm trying to move along, because I think my chat's getting bored. I don't know about your chat, but this is a boring conversation. I wanted to have a good, entertaining discussion about Trump and if he's good or bad, and we're getting so bogged down in the numbers. And I agree it's important, but I'm just saying, let's do this in DMs and have a good and not boring conversation on stream, okay?
When someone says that trust the experts, trust the data, and then's unwilling to talk about what the experts say with the data, I think you should be highly suspicious of them.
So you're just highly suspicious of expertise?
Of you.
Okay.
That's what I'm highly suspicious of, someone who says trust the experts, and then when we start looking at the data, you say, no, we don't have time for that.
Okay.
Cool.
All right.
Move on to what you want.
Move along then. I think it's a very pressing issue that we're going to be. You said that freedom was important to you, human rights important to me. The way I'm seeing this, we're looking down the barrel of massive rollbacks of human rights and freedoms under a second Trump administration. I don't know how you can see that otherwise. Basically, between I'm thinking, women losing their rights and immigrants definitely losing their rights. I mean, trans people losing the right to just even feel safe and exist in society. I'm like, where's the freedom in any of this? I'm not seeing the freedom.
What human rights, for example, are women losing?
Their right to bodily autonomy.
Okay, so what's Trump's plan that's going to take away a woman's right to bodily autonomy?
He punted back abortion to the states.
Okay.
So that's the answer to your question.
So if Trump wasn't elected and say Kamala was elected, she would have done what? An executive order?
I don't know what legislation again, we need some sort of amendment. We don't have the votes for said amendment. I understand the realpolitik behind it. I don't know what is the best solution to enshrine a constitutional right to abortion in this country. I'm just saying that before Trump, we had Roe v. Wade as the law of the land. That's how it should be. It should never have gone away. I attribute that to Trump, and I think that's one of the reasons why he has been bad for the country.
Okay, so just to be clear, you have zero, despite the fact that you said that women will lose this right of theirs, you have zero example whatsoever of how it would have been different under Kamala than Trump, at all. You admit that Trump's basically not going to do anything and it's up to the states, and you don't have any articulation of how that would have been different under Kamala. Let's start from there, correct?
I would say that it's already been that Trump has made the world worse by by punting abortion back to the states. If you want to specifically talk about the future of his second term, then we can talk about the massive human rights violations that are going to come with mass deportation.
We could get on to those other issues. You outlined a bunch. I often hear this, that specific individuals will lose rights. So we're starting with women. That's the call that I heard the most from Democrats. Women will lose rights if Trump's elected. You can't articulate
They've already lost the rights.
So you're saying
them already.
okay, so you're saying regardless if Trump would have been elected this point or not, he will now have no net benefit or degradation to women's rights. It's already happened. It's already
I'm
done.
not saying that.
Okay, then what will the net decrease in women's rights be now that Trump's in office?
Trump will be able to do from this point to further.
So you don't have any. You have no articulation. Got it.
I
Okay.
do have an articulation, Rob. Remember how I said that Trump already did this to.
But we're talking about Trump.
And then I said, if you want to talk what he's going to do in the future in his second term, we can talk about mass deportations. Remember that.
Okay, so when it comes to women's rights, you have no example of anything that Trump's going to do in this term that will affect women's rights at all. Cool. Now let's talk specifically what he did.
About anything. He won't
talk
about his healthcare plan. He won't talk about like if he wants to do a national.
It's a nice deflection.
Plan.
We got you. It's a nice deflection. So you've talked about how women's rights will be under attack with Trump. You can't give any examples. Now you can't give any examples of what he'll do in this term. So now let's look back.
Matters, man.
No, it doesn't when we're talking about what he will do this time. So if we're trying to decide will Trump be good or bad, then we're using that comparatively. Okay, right. Going forward, will Trump be good? Okay, we're going to stick with women's rights. Now, so now that you can't articulate anything that he will do in this term to negatively affect women's rights, let's go back and look at what he did in 2016 to 2020. Now, he didn't punt the issue back to the states, correct? What did he do? Can you articulate what he did?
Yeah, they overturned Roe v. Wade.
Who does they?
The Supreme Court.
Okay, so Trump had nothing to do with that. He merely
appointed the 3 members that were integral in the repeal.
Was he allowed to appoint? Is that within the democratic process that he's allowed to appoint these judges?
Yep.
Okay, and is it true that judges oftentimes interpret the Constitution in different ways?
Is this a real question?
Yes.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so the argument then that Trump didn't do anything illegal, you're just saying that by appointing the judges that he appointed, that resulted in women losing rights, which was bad. Now, do you think that the Supreme Court, it's important for the Supreme Court to do what their constitutional duty is, which is to interpret the law? Mm-hmm. So you don't want the Supreme Court creating law, correct?
Nope.
Okay, are you aware what the 10th Amendment says?
Yep.
What's it say?
Says that any power that is not enumerated within the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that is reserved for the federal government is a power for the people.
For the states. It would go to the states, correct?
Sure.
Okay. So then can you explain to me, is abortion ever mentioned in the Constitution?
No.
Okay. So then why did the court in Roe determine that a woman had a right to abortion?
I'm not a legal scholar.
But if you're making the argument that Trump was bad for women's rights, but you're also saying that it's important for the court to not create law, then you have to understand that if the court actually
it's more important for women to have rights than it is for the court not to create law.
So you say that a woman's right to abortion is more important than the court holding to their constitutional duties? Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think we could see who's a danger to people's rights then. Because what you're saying is
human rights are more important than the Supreme Court fulfilling its duties.
But the best document to enshrine our human rights is the Constitution. And by blatantly being unconstitutional
I don't know,
and saying that, yes.
I don't know.
Yes, of course it is. It's your rationale as to exactly what the establishment has done when they attack such as our First Amendment. When they say, well, we're going to have panels on disinformation that will censor people's ability to speak. And they would say, well, because the Constitution's not as important as this particular issue of ours. And our issue right now is we can't have people disagreeing.
The Constitution just so he could stay in power in 2020.
Trump talked specifically about what he thought was a stolen election and said that some of the constitutional things about when we have elections needed to be put on hold.
So in that election was stolen. It was more important for Trump to stay in power than the Constitution. So why is saying that human rights are more important than the Constitution such a big deal? I mean, can we not all agree? Rob, do you not agree that human rights are more important than the Constitution?
No, I would say that the Constitution is where we get our governmental enforcement of our rights. The problem is we're going to disagree on what a right is. So what you've justified allowing to, for example, if I say I have a human right to have a machine gun, to have an AK-47 that's fully automatic, I have a human right to that. I feel that that's my human right. And you say, well, actually, the law says differently. And I say, fuck all that, I don't care. Would you say that's legitimate?
No, I would say that your priorities are different than my priorities.
Right. So it's your opinion on what's a human right. Do I have a human right to life?
Again, like if you're going down to morality, those are all subjective preferences.
No. You're saying that Trump is uniquely bad because he appointed Supreme Court justices, which I'll be able to articulate did the correct thing legally in overturning Roe v. Wade. You're saying that doesn't matter.
Incorrect.
You're saying that doesn't matter because morally women should have a right to choose. Now we're going to get into the morality of it, right? And so I'm asking you if people have a right to life.
Yeah.
Would your right to life supersede someone's right to choose?
Would my right to life supersede? Yeah.
So, for example, if I choose to punch you in the face,
yes, your right to punch ends at my face or whatever the saying is. Yeah, sure. I agree with all that. I know what you're saying. You're going to extend it to a fetus, but the thing is that the Constitutional Bill of Rights doesn't extend to the fetus. It extends to U.S. citizens, and you get your citizenship at birth.
One, why would that matter? You just said you don't give a shit. Human rights supersede what the Constitution says.
Yeah, and
okay. So then, what's it matter if the Constitution applies to fetuses? My
moral preference is in alignment with the Constitution on this.
When does life begin?
I think that life, as in a human person being, begins at birth.
Okay, so then you would say that it should be absolutely a woman's right to choose before the umbilical cord's cut to kill that baby.
At birth.
Okay,
I would also say, Rob,
define birth.
If I was going to ask you how long you've been alive, you would tell me you're in your 40s, and you would not add 9 months to that. So let's
I'm still alive.
Before that, act like we both don't start counting life from birth because we both do.
When you count with something like years is different than when we consider something life. We can understand that there's something different and that we would start calculating.
But if I ask you how long have you been alive, you're not going to start from your conception.
I would say my birthday is July 4th, 1984. But if I ask you
how long have you been alive, you would start from your birth, and so would.
That's not true. It's irrelevant to colloquially how we would discuss those things as to whether or not. So that's. So again, I will say
in the Bible. By the
way, I'm going to get my point out come hell or high water. I understand that you want to filibuster on this, so I just want to be clear. You said that a woman should have a right to abortion unimpeded, correct? Unimpeded. It should be her choice up until birth. Define birth.
You don't know what birth is?
That's right, because I said until the umbilical cord's cut. You said no. You were like birth.
The baby is no longer inside the mom. That baby has been born.
So just to be clear, if the baby's bottom's out but the head's inside, is it birthed?
I don't know, Rob.
Why are you shaking your head? This seems to be important when we decide we could kill something. It's not
important to me.
It's not important to you when we could take a life.
Dude, like, when is this happening? That the baby's halfway
Well, I'll tell you this. I had a debate in college where we debated Casey, which was the 92 decision that reaffirmed Roe. And I lost this debate to a radical feminist that told me that until the umbilical cord was cut, she had the right to kill it. And I was taking away her choice if I said otherwise. So I'm starting under that, which is one of the most extreme positions from someone who is heavily involved in abortion politics. So I'm trying to ask you when exactly the cutoff is. This seems to be important because when we're talking about when
they're
legally...
born, dude. Like, I told you the cutoff.
So if they're halfway breached, that would be considered born to you?
I don't know. That's a gray area, man. I would just leave the decision between that woman and her medical doctors.
So even in that decision, where the baby's halfway breached, you would say you're unwilling to have the law intervene. It should only be up to the woman and the doctor.
I mean, if the baby's halfway breached, right, and the woman's about to die, and
that's not the question.
Well,
you're adding things.
The woman, the medical doctor, like they come to that decision based on the medical facts.
That's not true. For example, I forget there was an article in, I believe, The Atlantic, where this doctor who specializes in late-term abortion says he'll give one for any reason, it doesn't matter, and far over 50% of the ones he gives into 8 and 9 months of pregnancy are for purely elective reasons. Has nothing to do with the safety of the woman or the health of the baby.
Why is it, Rob, that I want to talk about human rights? I try to bring up mass deportation, and now you're talking to me about the rights of a fetus.
The reason is because when people hyperbolically talk about what a threat to rights Trump will be, and then you interrogate what those threat to rights will be, they have no backing whatsoever. So you've already illustrated that you have no backing to how Trump would be threat to women's rights this time. And then when we said, okay, you're just upset about the overturning of Roe, you can't defend why the overturning of Roe, in my estimation, was good legal practice. And so then you say, well, you should just have a human right to kill that baby because it's not really a baby.
Okay,
and
I say in Roe, didn't they they were ruling from like the 14th Amendment, right? I mean,
Right to
they were
privacy.
using it based on amendments
And
in the
equal
Constitution and what their interpretation of
equal
that was.
rights,
They
right?
did
Equal
have a
rights and a
legal
right to
basis.
privacy, right? Equal rights and a right to privacy. None of those things are specifically outlined with abortion. It's absurd to think so. For example, we can see those things are overruled with things like the Patriot Act, right? So the idea that you should be able to kill a baby because you have a right to privacy is nonsensical, or an equal rights as a woman.
This is why. This is actually why I started the conversation by asking you how much your religious views impact your politics, because a lot of the people that I ask why they support Trump, they'll just go to abortion first of all, and I've just found that like the abortion debate is a difficult one to have, because ultimately like there's just such a difference in worldview where like the one side thinks that this like the fetus has a soul and is like a human person, and
have you heard me say anything like that?
Religious belief. And then
you haven't heard me say anything like that. The problem is that the position that you're advocating for is grotesque and out of line with the vast majority of people in this country. Thank God. I think that the people in this country are too left on pro-choice arguments, but you haven't heard me make any sort of religious argument or arguments of the soul whatsoever. You have defended that a woman at 9 months pregnancy before birth should be allowed to terminate that baby for any reason, which is a grotesque and monstrous fucking position. And for you to imply that that somehow means if we don't allow that, that that's an attack on women's rights, I think should clarify to everyone that's listening how absurd and egregious these attacks on Trump are that you're going to be making.
Can you give me one other example where, like you said, that somebody's rights to punch extend for as far as somebody's face is? So can you tell me what human rights apply to a person who is physically located inside of another person?
It doesn't matter.
No, it does matter, right? Because you said that I have the right to punch until that punch is close to somebody's face. So what are the human rights that you would have if you physically lived inside of another person? What rights do you have in that situation, Rob?
Let's say hypothetically that there are giant people that come down, giant space.
And you live inside one.
And I live inside, so I no longer have rights? You could kill me?
I'm just saying, like, what
I'm asking you.
You have if you exist inside of another person, how do their rights and your rights intersect? I mean,
the fact that the Constitution doesn't specifically say these rights apply to people that live in all of these situations is irrelevant. So I'm asking you specifically.
To citizens, and you become a citizen at birth.
No, it doesn't just apply to citizens.
Some of the Bill of Rights applies to non-citizens, but most apply to citizens.
Well, it's not just the Bill of Rights, but certainly some would apply. Like, for example, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they say is to all peoples, correct?
Yeah, unborn peoples.
So, for example, if there is a guest,
another thing.
Let me finish my point. So, for example, if there is someone who is a guest of our country who has a passport and decides to come visit the beautiful city of Pittsburgh that's around me, can I just say, well, I'll kill them? They're not a citizen, so they don't have rights.
No.
Can I say that? Why not?
Do you remember what I just said about how some rights apply to non-citizens, but not all?
So we're talking specifically about the right to life. You haven't illustrated how the right to life only applies to citizens.
Okay, look.
So you gave a non-analogous example to what we're talking about.
Happen to agree with the UN Charter on Human Rights in this issue, where it says specifically that the right to life does not apply to the unborn. Okay. So
I don't give a shit what the UN says. I don't give a shit, right? You can't articulate. Your position is grotesque.
Subjective preferences, okay?
Let me ask you this.
We have differing preferences.
The European Union, your advocacy is for a woman should be allowed to terminate up to birth, which would include 9 months. Does the UN countries allow that?
With the, like, if it's in the medical interest of the woman. I don't personally care.
Wait. If it's in the medical interest.
Let me finish my stance, Rob, because you've been misattributing my stance. I think you've been misunderstanding my stance on this whole thing, okay? I am against regulations on first and second trimester abortions. For third trimester abortions, right? I personally am fine with regulating to the point where there are exceptions for the health of the mother, right? There are exceptions for attenuating circumstances like incest, rape, whatever. But I'm okay with limiting third trimester abortion. That's my particular.
So you would you think that the government should eliminate a woman's right to choose?
I think that there are room for compromise. It's not something that I'm not willing to die on the hill for third trimester, yes or no, whatever. I think that there's room to negotiate there. That's my own personal take on it. Okay. since you didn't ask what my personal take on it was until, I mean, you still didn't. I'm just telling you that's my own personal take, okay?
So there are circumstances where you would say, because you value the right to life of the fetus in certain circumstances, that you're against the woman's right to choose, and you would be okay with government laws regulating that.
I'm for compromise. Personally, okay? Personally, I would just have it be the woman's right the whole way. But I'm for compromise. I think we
That's not an answer.
For example,
that's not an answer.
For example, I think that the way that Ireland does it is fine. I'm like, Ireland had this specifically where they had compromise on the third trimester. I'm fine with that. I understand there's arguments for and back and forth, whatever. I don't really debate abortion. I've never done it on my channel. It's not a subject that I've ever gone out.
You brought it up. Yeah, these aren't things that I'm bringing up. You brought it up.
To get the topic to mass deportation, Rob.
What you did, let me explain what you did.
Okay.
You made a bunch of hyperbolic talking points. Trump's taking away people's rights, like women's. And then we started to interrogate, and you can't defend that position. And so now you want to run from the position because you realized how grotesque your position was, defending 9-month abortions. And so now you're like, well, even though personally I would allow 9-month abortions, I'm okay with the government saying you can't have them except for exceptions like the woman's life. So you are for, in certain instances, the government taking away a woman's right to choose. So for example, if Kamala Harris would have ran on the position, I'm going to pass an executive order that says women can have a right to abortion in first and second trimester, but in the third trimester she cannot unless her life's in jeopardy or there's certain circumstances with the child. And Trump ran on the position he did, which was, look, we're leaving it up to the states. I'm not going to sign a national abortion ban. Which one would have been more antithetical to a woman's right to choose?
I wasn't paying attention to anything that you were just talking about.
Well, it seems to illustrate that this isn't a worthwhile debate if you're not going to engage in it back and forth and give me the dignity of listening to me.
Okay, well...
Would you like me to repeat the question?
Okay, Rob, really, I think that I don't know how your audience can be enjoying this right now. Like, I wanted to talk about, like... You know, I brought up my 3 points I wanted to talk about.
You hit a topic, and then when you're proven wrong, you're like, can we move? That's what you do.
Do what?
You hit a topic, and then when you're proven wrong, you're like, I want to move to something else.
Okay, so you're saying that I was proven wrong that Trump is bad for human rights because he's taken away women's freedom to abortion. I was proven wrong about that.
You are absolutely, you said that he would be bad for women's rights. I asked what he would do in this term. You couldn't give any examples. Then you said, but it was bad that it was bad that he kicked it to the states. Then we went and you were like, well, okay, he appointed judges, which overturned Roe. Then you were unable to articulate whether or not that was good legal policy, and in fact said, you're okay if it's unconstitutional, that they wouldn't have overturned Roe because you think that a woman's right to choose is more important. So then we started to get into hypotheticals. Well, then what do you define as being an important woman's right to choose? Does that supersede a right to life?
Rob, just please, man, just make.
If you don't want to do a debate, if you don't want to, I have to walk through how we got to where we are because you're arguing, well, we need to move on because you're being embarrassed on the subject. No, I could say, since you're incapable, I will say this for 30 seconds, then we'll move on since you're incapable. You would be forced to say that if Kamala Harris was for third trimester abortions being eliminated, that she was anti-woman's right to choose. And therefore, electing her would have been taking away women's rights, and that would be worse than Trump that said, I'm just going to leave it up to the states. So in that articulation, I think we could prove the absurdity of your argument that Trump's taking away women's rights is absurd. You know nothing about what you're talking about and have tried to run from the conversation as soon as you made it because you realized you're outclassed.
No, I think you're misreading the situation here.
I'm not.
I think that the honest reading about this is that personally, as two dudes, I don't debate this topic. I mean, that is the end-all be-all.
Then why would you say that he's taking away women's rights if you're like, I don't want to talk about it?
I was listing multiple things, Rob.
But you listed one thing that is the most common thing.
I didn't. You just stopped listening after the first thing.
No. Okay, if I say this person should be executed for the following 4 reasons, and your argument's going to be, I think all 4 of these reasons are bullshit, so let's go through them one by one. And as soon as you go through the first one, I'm like, I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to talk about that. Let's move on to another one. It seems to suggest that you're saying shit that you don't know what you're talking about.
That's what you just said then, right? You said that it would be worse if Kamala were to eliminate third trimester abortions.
That would be against the woman's
Trump's
right.
policy of just passing it along to the
Correct.
state. You're saying that
That's
her
what you would have
policy
to say.
would be more of like threatening women's right to choose.
Correct.
If her policy was just blanketly getting rid of third trimester abortions with no exceptions in all states in America, I might agree with you. But I think it's kind of a weird and useless hypothetical. But here's the difference and why I said might agree with you, right? You're taking away women's right to a third trimester abortions for every state in the union versus only half the states in the union,
He's not
whatever
doing
the
that.
number.
He's leaving it up to the states.
Yeah, leaving it up to states where the states will be stripping away that right for women. That could be for all trimesters. It could be no.
Give me an example of a state that's done it for all trimesters.
So I'm just saying that it does depend. And I know you hate me injecting nuance and subtlety and actually looking at the different factors, but there are it just depends on the specifics, Rob. You can't just make these ambiguous blanket statements. Like, this is worse than this because it depends on the specifics. Like in Texas, where I live, the abortion laws have been awful and women have literally died because they had miscarriages or like sepsis or literally having health emergencies where they needed an abortion for their own life and were not able to receive one and died. That has happened in this state.
So there was one example that I heard of, and it turned out, I don't know if it was in Texas, but the case that people cited most was actually a woman who died because she took the anti-abortion pill and doctors didn't operate fast enough and had nothing to do with the overturning of Roe. It's just an excuse.
Yeah, but that is not the example that I'm bringing.
Okay, give me the example. What was the woman's name?
Jessica Bonarchy or something like that.
Okay, and so what happened? Can you explain to me exactly what happened?
So she had a miscarriage, I believe, that basically you have to go in and you have to clear out the remains of the fetus, which is technically an abortion. And so being unable to perform this because the doctors were concerned that they were going to lose their license, they were not able to, and she went into like sepsis, basically. Like, I mean,
I don't believe this story at face value. It's
why
something
not?
I'd be willing to, because the last time that we've heard a story of this, it turned out to be inaccurate when this woman who took the anti-abortion pill. Secondly, I don't think that the law is specifically going to say that if someone has a dead fetus inside them, that the law says that it can't be removed.
That's true, though. That is the law in Texas.
So the law in Texas says if there's a dead fetus inside you, you can't have it removed.
Yeah.
I don't believe that.
Okay.
Show me the law.
Okay. Well, we'll pull it up then. I don't know how to find it exactly.
I don't believe that at all. I think that's bullshit. So you mean to say that they just have to live for the next 10, 15, 20 years with
No,
a
they
dead
just can't
fetus?
use an abortion to clear it.
Oh, so they could clear it in certain ways.
I don't know what the alternative ways to clear it are or how long they take.
Well, isn't abortion defined as taking away a living fetus?
Yeah, we're getting also lots of different names in the chat of women. Avery Davis Bell. Here's the one, Jessica Barnica. That's the one I was thinking.
Okay.
Of. And then
Jessica Barnica.
Thurman. There's multiple in Texas that this has already happened to.
Okay, so your argument is that the law in Texas says that if there is a fetus inside you, they can't get rid of it through what we would normally call an abortion. So they have to do some other intervention to take the baby out.
I will look at the exact phrasing of the law. I'll pull it up here. Let's see. So, wait, maybe her name is not Jessica. Josely Barnica. And yeah, she was, let's see. It would be a crime to intervene in her miscarriage at the Texas hospital that she is at.
So just to be clear, that's, if I'm judiciously interpreting this as best as possible, what you just said, that has nothing to do with what you just said 5 seconds ago.
Well, it said here, the fetus was on the verge of coming out. So its head pressed against her dilated cervix. And let's see, they offered to speed up the delivery to enter her uterus to stave off a deadly infection that she had. But they had to wait until there was no longer a heartbeat because it would be a crime to do the procedure while it still had a heartbeat. And so they had to wait for, I guess she wasn't able to receive treatment for 40 hours and died.
So your initial claim that a dead fetus inside a person, it's illegal to remove,
that
was bullshit.
A dead fetus. Yes.
That was bullshit. You were absolutely wrong about that. Just to clarify.
Yeah, I was incorrect about that.
My guess is
The reason why these women were dying was because the fetus still had a heartbeat and they weren't able to get the abortion until they had to wait for the fetus to be dead. So I was wrong about the dead remains in the womb.
Okay, so what I would say is it's probably a misinterpretation of the law. I haven't looked at the specific Texas law. I'll claim ignorance on that. I knew what you were saying was bullshit. But my guess is the law says after a certain point that you're not allowed to remove a living fetus unless the woman's health is in jeopardy. There's a risk of loss of life. And I'm guessing the way this would be implied is the doctors will say, well, we didn't know what that risk was. We didn't know what the risk of this woman was. We knew that there were potential health effects, but we didn't know how severe. And unfortunately, she ended up passing. So I'm betting that what this would be a misapplication of the way the law was written. Nonetheless.
So, but just to be clear, right? You did the disclaimer before you made that statement about what you think it is, that you are actually ignorant and don't know anything about the specifics about either the law or this specific
No,
case.
what I'm saying is when I asked you, people say this all the time. I've heard one case that was brought up nationally that was used incorrectly. Okay. And then I said, what are the specifics? It's clear that I'm saying I don't know what the specific Texas law is by the fact that I'm asking you. You gave an explanation.
So then why would you offer
You gave an explanation.
If you don't have
You gave an explanation. What do you mean? Why am I offering my thoughts on it? I didn't offer my thoughts on what the Texas law said. You said that there were states that had laws that
said it was a misreading of the Texas law.
That's right. I knew that it was a misreading of the law that you said.
Well, how do you know it's a misreading if you don't know any of the details?
Because what you said was so specifically outlandish that it beggars belief that any first world country.
What I said at this
yes,
point.
we were.
Story. No, wait. We're talking about. You said that the story that this Jessica Barnacki. You said that the story, independent of anything that I said, you said that the story was likely not going to be true because it was likely just a misreading of the Texas law. And you acknowledge the fact that you know nothing about either the Texas law or the specifics of the case, but you're still offering that commentary. Why?
Okay, two things. One, I initially knew that your statements that you were making were complete bullshit. You admit they were. Correct? Cool.
I was wrong.
There.
Yeah.
Secondly, I'm saying that I'm guessing that this is a misapplication of the law. That I'm guessing, this is why I asked you to read this.
But why are you guessing that?
Because I'm highly doubting that the Texas law says that even if the woman will die, you can't do an abortion. I bet that that's bullshit. That's what I'm saying.
So, but why?
Prove me wrong. Because it would be outlandish that happened.
And it was
illegal. It would be outlandish that happened, and it's not the biggest story in the news cycle of this election. If there's literally
like you, Rob, just
no, that's not true. That's not true.
They don't believe it.
That's not true. If the law, listen, I understand the need to filibuster. I get it. If the law literally said, even if the woman will die, no abortion. If that law is on the books right now in Texas, I'll guarantee it would have been the biggest story going into this election.
Okay, well, let's find the exact
the
Texas abortion law then. Do you want to talk about mass deportation in the meantime while we look at the exact wording? Because
we could if you would like to move on, that you've committed that you're bullshitting, that you haven't given any.
I can tell that you did debate in college because all your little rhetorical strategies are very slimy.
Listen, here's the thing. I think that you want to commit mass genocide against white people, black people, men, women, gays, and Christians.
Why?
That's what I think.
But why do you think that?
Because I could tell that that's what you do from the things you've said.
What did I say?
You've said those sort of things about those groups.
What did I say?
All sorts of things about those groups.
Can you offer any quote?
Can we move on? Why are we still on this?
So you
see the absurdity of your position? When you say Trump's going to be bad for human rights because here's a bunch of groups and he's going to take human rights all these specific groups. I'm like, cool. Let's take the one that's been the most prominent talked about, women.
Which is immigrants.
And we've gone through. No, women was the one.
Immigrants for sure.
That's not true. That's not true. It was women that was the group. That was the galvanizing effort. That's been ever since Roe v. Wade's been overturned. Been the galvanizing.
Rob, the biggest issue of this election was immigration. I'm sorry, but this is just revisionist history that you're offering for us right now.
That's not true.
If you ask anybody what the biggest issue is, it's the economy, it's immigration.
Okay, so I want you, this is what you're saying, that the Democrats' message in the last election and in this one, since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, has been we must protect immigrants. That's what the majority of Kamala Harris's ads were. It wasn't women's right to choose.
No, the issue was about was about immigration. That was the big
No. That's what Trump was talking about. But what the Democrats were talking about when they were talking about taking away people's rights, the first group that they were referencing over and over again was women.
Yeah, because they.
So you admit
they
it.
surrendered to the right-wing framing on immigration. Yeah, I did not.
So
like
you admit that I'm correct and you were wrong on this. Got it.
No,
so,
I don't agree with your framing on this, Rob.
You just said that, yes, that is true. That's the group that Democrats said's rights were going to be taken away the most, but you criticized them for that.
You were trying to say that this is, okay, we're getting way into the meta conversation of this about shit that doesn't matter. Like, all I was objecting to was you saying that this election was all about women losing their rights, okay? This election was about immigrants.
I didn't say that. I said that the group that we're told was going to lose their rights first and foremost were women. That's what the people that say that Trump's going to be disasters for human rights, that's the first group they talk about. You were unable to defend that. You want to move on to immigrants?
Dude, the way that you phrase this, Rob, is just, I can tell that you have been doing this. You have rhetorical skills. You like to have this meta commentary about the debate that frames it for your audience. I just want to talk about the substance with you. Can we stop doing all of this meta?
Yes, that's what we're doing. You say, if you list 3 particular groups who you think human rights are going to be taken away, why can't I look at one of those groups and interrogate why you think that? Why is it that as soon as I do you say, I don't want to talk about that group? I'm going to move on to another.
For the last 40 minutes, Rob. I have let you do that for 40 minutes.
If you want to move on, I'm sufficiently happy that I proved that you didn't know what you were talking about this women's issue.
This is the meta-narrative that I talked about.
If you want to move on
wait, Rob.
So you're having a meta-narrative about the meta-narrative. You're having a meta-narrative about the meta-narrative.
If you want to move with the substance.
Okay, do you want to talk about immigrants?
Yes.
Okay, what rights are immigrants being taken away by Trump?
That there is a right that you have, right, to be with your family. Okay, if your family is American citizens, right, they were born in this country. You know, if you're working in this country, I don't think that somebody has the right to just forcibly relocate you. You know?
Okay,
you're being a productive member of society. You've got a family here. You've got connections here. You've got a job here. You're paying taxes here. I don't see how anybody has the right to come and remove you from the country.
Okay, so let's start with some baseline stuff. You wouldn't say that anyone has the right to come to this country, correct?
I don't know. I don't know.
So wait,
I have a strong opinion on that.
So you don't have a strong opinion as to whether or not the United States has any say in keeping anyone out? You don't have an opinion on that?
No, I mean, I think that, like, yeah, okay. I think that you should basically be able to regulate immigration to a certain degree, but I don't think it should be so arbitrary. Like, I think that basically you should stop people on the terrorist watch list from coming in, or you should stop people that have, like, known, documented criminal histories of violent crimes, that kind of thing. And so I agree that legal immigration is better than illegal immigration. I think we should increase the amount of legal immigration to disincentivize illegal immigration. That's my stance.
So first, you didn't have a strong stance on if we should be allowed to keep anyone out. Now I'll leave you adjust your position, which your position now, I'm trying to steel man your position. Mm-hmm. We only have the right to keep out people that are known terrorists or violent criminals. Fair position?
Yeah, sure.
So that means anyone. Let's say there's a person who has no connections to the United States whatsoever, and they live in Russia. Okay. And we don't have any proof that their connections to violent crime or the evil government of Russia. And they're like, yeah, I want to come to the United States. Mm-hmm. We have no right to say no. They should be allowed to come in.
I think that there is like a human right for for being able to move. You know, you should be able to live where you want to live. I think that is a great part about human freedom.
So your articulation would be that even if we had a president who would say, yeah, actually, we're going to put a hard cap at 50 million people a year we could leave in. That 51 millionth person, 50 million and one person, if they said, sorry, we can't take any more, we have violated that person's rights, as long as they're not a criminal.
Yeah, I just don't think that's a very realistic situation, but sure, I'll give it to you.
Okay, well, then I would say that you have a problem of you're making a criticism about Trump that literally would be made of every politician in every nation ever. That they would be
I think that
violating people's rights because there is no credible politician that would have any effect whatsoever at actually having a thriving country that would say literally anyone, as long as they're not a terrorist or criminal, is allowed in here.
See,
That
like,
doesn't
but
exist.
this is all I hear from the right, right? Is that the other side is pushing open borders, and now you're saying that nobody on Earth would ever push open borders.
They
Like,
would, even the people that are pushing open borders would say that there's certain specific people that they wouldn't want.
and I
That's
already said
beyond
that.
just criminals. That's beyond just criminals.
Like what? Who is undesirable?
Like, for example, even the people that want open borders in this country, like Democrats, wouldn't accept like 3 billion people.
Okay, yeah. Do you think that anybody's advocating for you think I'm advocating for 3 billion people?
Well, if you're saying that it is a human right for anyone who wants to come here to be able to, eventually that would lead to a policy where we would be too filled up and we would have to eventually turn people away.
So
Which that would mean at that moment
I
you
don't
would
think
say
that is the
we're
case, Rob. I don't think
that's
that's
bullshit.
logical.
That is certainly the case.
I don't think that eventually we would get to a point where we're just filled up. I don't think that that's
Let's
logically how
go a
that would
little
work.
further with this. Do you think that the people that come to this country that are immigrants, illegal, legal, whatever, do you think they should be entitled to welfare benefits such as health care, education, food stamps, WIC if they have kids here?
Some and not others. Again,
Give me an example
I
of the
know you
ones
really
not.
don't like nuance. You want it to be all or nothing here, but I do think, like, for one, they already have healthcare. I worked in operating rooms. We've done surgeries on illegal immigrants, and guess who's paying for it? Not the government.
The illegal immigrant?
No.
Then who?
Basically, the hospital eats the cost and then passes on that cost to private insurance companies that then increase.
Then we pay more through our insurance.
Yeah, so through private insurance.
Gotcha.
But it's not
Okay.
government program.
Sure, gotcha.
So-
But either way, it's the taxpayers, it's the legal citizens of this country that's paying for it. I want you
So
to give
this
me
is
the
point that I'm
examples.
gonna make, though. Allow me to make my point here, right? Because yes, okay, like immigrants do like take services up, like healthcare and like education infrastructure and stuff. But when you actually crunch the whole numbers and you look on net, what is the impact, right? You will find that it's basically universal consensus, except for maybe the Heritage Foundation, that like what the numbers actually show. You were talking about that you're big into the data. Like if you're looking at like what the actual numbers show, that tax revenue of all types generated by immigrants, both legal and illegal, exceed the total cost of like the services that they are receiving. So there
We could get in it. We could get into the data and what number of immigrants should we allow, et cetera, et cetera. That's different than what your criticism of Trump is, which is that he would be bad for human rights. And so when we asked specifically on women, we went through that conversation. Now we're on immigrants. And so when asked specifically, what are the rights that you're talking about? You basically say the right to travel and live where you want, as long as you're not a criminal.
So I'll explain to you exactly what I see as a violation of human rights, right? So if you're a family, you're a mixed household, right? Some people in the household are.
That's not what you're already getting off
You've given me
track.
so many hypotheticals that I've listened to, Rob.
No. You're already getting off track because here's
I'm
the
not
deal.
getting off topic. I mean,
This is what
literally
you're going to do. We're trying to
filibustering.
broaden. No, what we're
You're
trying to do is.
filibustering me now.
Okay, you can talk. I'll tell everyone what you're going to do. You're going to now go from the principle of what the right should be to talk about, but this person who has a family here and he's working hard and he's paying taxes, that's a violation of his right to kick him out. I understood you
That's
said
not
that
what I was
initially.
gonna say.
Okay, then you go ahead and talk, and then I'll be able to explain. I'm predicting what you're going to do is get more specific than rather talk about the general principle of what the human right is. Go ahead.
Okay, Rob, isn't that what you've been doing to me all night with
No.
your hypotheticals? You're saying, oh, well, what would you be okay with 3 billion people? Oh, what about this highly specific instance of like a woman's health? Like you've been going into some very specific hypothetical examples with me all night. So I'm going to do this one time here. Okay. You have a mixed household. Some are documented, some are not. The ICE or National Guard or whoever the Trump administration comes, knocks on the door, says, hey, like, we've heard you have an undocumented worker here, John or whatever. They take John. And then while they're there, they're like, oh, hey, like, do you have any other, like, we want to see everybody's papers. Now, all of a sudden, oh, Abuela doesn't have her papers and Uncle Ricky doesn't have his papers. And they're splitting the household apart. I consider that to be a violation of human rights, and I think it's pretty gross. I don't know what your specific takes are on a circumstance like that. Do you just think that that's not going to happen, or do you acknowledge that circumstances just like that are going to be happening with any mass deportation policy, and that's super fucked up and bad?
So as predicted, what he did was go to the specific when the entire point was when he first started to talk about the specific, I said, okay, if we're talking about the general principle of violating someone's human rights, what is that right? What is the right that we're violating? And I started with the position that I thought he would clearly agree with me, and he didn't. I said, well, clearly there are circumstances when governments should be allowed to say, we're allowed to control who comes in and who comes out. He said, I'm not sure, I don't have strong feelings on that. And then he said, okay, just the people that are criminals. So the violation of the right that he's talking about is specifically your right to live wherever you want. I started to talk about welfare and things like that to kind of articulate how non-tenable that would be for a society if you say anyone who wants to come here should be allowed to come here, regardless of what those numbers of people would be, and we'll give them free services, because that would encourage millions upon millions of people to come, to the point that it would eventually become untenable. That's the direction we were going. He skips from that. He says, no. Now I want to go back to the specific and talk about this one heart-wrenching story that would be a specific. But the entailment would be that any policy that any leader had that would say, yeah, we're going to control our border to some degree, would, in his estimation, be taking away the rights, the human rights of these people. So you can see when he criticizes the taking away of human rights, his interpretation will be so broad that it would basically mean anyone that would be any sort of reasonable leader would be violating rights. Now he wants to talk about the specific scenario, and he'll say, but this specific scenario is violating rights worse. Well, this would be similar to me saying a bunch of things. We shouldn't have laws that for crimes that are nonviolent then. For example, non-payment of child support shouldn't exist. Why? Because if we arrest someone for non-payment of child support, then we're ripping someone away from their family.
Are you getting too specific now with your examples, Rob?
Well, no, what I'm doing,
me about that.
Well, that's because I've now delved into the specific.
Oh, yeah. Now you have.
I've delved into. If I say to you
specific, but I can't.
No, that's not what's going on. What you're talking about a human right, the impetus is on you when you're saying this guy is a danger because he'll harm human rights. And I say, what right? And you're like, this guy. This one guy, like, imagine how ridiculous that would be. If I said, if I said this, Kamala Harris will violate human rights. And you're like, well, give me an example. And I say, right to free speech. And you're like, give me an example. And I say, my friend Larry, you know what happened? He made a meme online, and the FBI under Biden came and visited him. So that Larry, and you'll be like, okay, but what's the general principle that you're talking about? Larry, I'm talking about Larry. You would be like, but what is that principle?
Rob,
should you be allowed to say? And so you would say things like this. In order to come to some agreement, what we're talking about, you might say, well, let's start with this. Do you have the right to say whatever you want online? Or do you think there should be some governmental limitations? For example, you can't be.
This is mind-numbing, dude.
It is not mind-numbing. It is clear.
Please, man.
It is clear. It is clear.
To make your points.
No.
It's up so many examples to make your points that you could make succinctly, man. It's
you can't understand the succinct point. Look, you're incapable of understanding it, or you're willfully pretending you don't.
You are having an issue with me illustrating a point with an example, but you do it every time you open your mouth.
That's not. It's okay to illustrate a point with an example, but I'm asking you what the principle that you're advocating for. It is a human rights violation too. What is that right? And the right that you're saying is the right for any person who wants to come here to come here. That's listen. Just real quick. Just real quick. Fuck you and your audience. I'll yell all I want. And if you want to put smug, I could put smug things up on the channel too for my audience to see what a disingenuous prick you are and how you're not a very good debater. So I can put those up if you want. If your audience doesn't like my yelling or you think that it's something that you don't care for, you're free to leave at any point. No problem whatsoever. Now, the point is when we're talking about the specific principle of human right that's being violated, yes or no, you're saying it's that right for any person to come here if they want and live here. Yes or no? As long as they're not a criminal.
I don't know. If you want to give me the specific right that will be violated by mass deportations, I would say that it's the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So do you define the right to life as a person, as long as they're not a criminal, anyone who wants to come live here?
No.
But that's what you said earlier. Why are you changing your position?
Because, man, quite frankly, like, talking with you is a lot more annoying than I thought it would be. Like, I thought we could have a discussion that would be like two normal human
We were.
adults having a discussion with this. And like the way that you talk about things is just to try to like use small insignificant points to try to score rhetorical points to make it sound like your overarching points make sense when they just don't. Like when we're talking about mass deportations, we're talking about what that actually looks like, and you're trying to make the point, or at least you seem like you're trying to make the point, that you can do a mass deportation without gross violations of human rights, because you're saying, well, look, you need to articulate what specific human rights will be violated. But I really don't think that you hold this position in actuality. I think you're just trying to score little rhetorical points in this debate.
That's not
like,
true. That's
okay,
not
okay.
true.
Then if it's not true, then like, do you really think that you can do a mass deportation without violating human rights?
We'll get to that point here.
I want to hear you answer that.
I will answer.
Rob,
I will answer that. Yes, I do. Just like you could arrest people without violating human rights if they break a law. So, for example, there is something that we could feel tragic. We could say you have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness when it comes to living with your family. You do not have the right to take your family, move into your house, and say, "Fuck you, we all live here now." And if the cops come to remove me, I say that's a violation of my rights. You're removing me from my family.
We agree with that.
Right now, let me talk specifically about what you're doing here. If I was to say, I think if Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or whatever else would get elected, they would take away my human right to self-defense. And you said, well, how do you define a right to self-defense? Do you think that you should be allowed to have nuclear weapons? And I said, well, I don't know. You would be like, wait, what? So you're saying that any limitation on weapons whatsoever would be a violation of your rights? That seems to be a relevant discussion between two people. You have to have a baseline to understand what you're talking about. It wouldn't be sufficient of me to say, well, it would be a violation of human rights because they might say that this one specific gun I have shouldn't be allowed to have with a bump stock. And you'd be like, but what is that right that's being violated? There's a disagreement you have. You think there's a policy disagreement for sort of practical applications that you would disagree with. But is that a violation of your human rights? What is the principle that you're talking about? It's the same thing here. When you're talking about taking away the rights, because you had just said, you would agree, this is where the debate becomes. We all have a right, for example, to freely associate and talk to the people we want, right? You have a First Amendment right. You agree with that?
Okay.
But if we go to prison, some of those rights are taken away.
You can lose your rights. I agree.
Right. So then the argument that we're making is if the human right is anyone has the right to be here, then you're right. If that's how you define the human right, then yes, kicking anyone out would be a violation of their rights. If your argument is separating people from their family is a human rights violation, now we're talking about something different because I could say, well, there are times when that wouldn't be a human rights violation.
Let me clarify then. My point is that the human rights violations that come with mass deportations, like the separating from family or whatever, are disproportionate to the crime. So I do agree that you can commit crimes where a proportionate response would be to violate your rights and separate you from your family or whatever, like horrible, violent crimes. I do agree in principle that you can, it makes sense to violate your rights if you commit a terrible enough crime. What we are differentiating about is that I don't think illegally immigrating is a bad enough crime to warrant such a punishment. You do. That is the source of our disagreement.
Now we're getting, this is what I thought you would say initially. That's why I started from a baseline. And this sort of stuff's necessary to have in a discussion because, like, let's assume that you're a complete communist that believes in big government and I'm a complete ANCAP, right? You would say, well, clearly, Rob, you would think sometime it should be like illegal to murder people. And I'm like, no. Okay, well, then that's where the debate needs to go. So I thought you would have the reasonable position of course, not everyone who wants to come here can come here. There's certain, yes, of course, our government has the right to say, we're going to allow the people we want in and not the people. And then the conversation would go to, so clearly there's times where we could do things like that. So now let's talk specifically about what's going on and whether or not, I disagree with you. You're having a threshold issue here. You're saying the crime of kicking someone out is disproportionate, or the solution of kicking someone out is disproportionate to the crime of coming here illegally.
Yes.
I disagree. That is the exact punishment. If you do something, that would be like saying the crime of stealing something from a shop, the punishment of forcing me to put it back is too much. Totally disagree.
Well, so the reason why, right, is that, like, one, I think that the punishment of deportation harms the country as a whole. So,
but that's different. Real quick, that's different than rights. That's saying
I
that
understand that's
practically it's a
different than
bad
rights.
idea.
I understand that's different than rights. I'm saying, like, in the scenario where somebody steals something and you're asking what is the proper punishment for that, it makes sense that the punishment would be for them to give it back, because that's like, there's multiple economic and moral reasons to justify that.
The
In
moral
this
reasons.
case, I think that there's not economic reasons to justify deportation. In fact, it is an economic ill for the country. It's good for the country to have more immigrants. You're saying, oh, well, we'll just fill up the whole country. Like, if you look historically, the number one determining factor in how successful a nation is in its geopolitical position is its rate of population increase. That's just this history, right? If you want America to be the number one superpower, we need to grow our population. We can't do it with our natural birth rates alone, right? So again, just from the position of having America's best interests in mind, economically, geostrategically, immigration, legal and illegal, is good. I just want more legal immigration, less illegal. I think we should incentivize these things differently. That's where I'm coming from in terms of that. In terms of the proper punishment for illegal immigrants, I think that punishment needs to be not harmful to the country, not harmful to America. I don't think it makes sense to harm the country to punish illegal immigrants.
So notice what happened here. This is a completely different conversation than rights. So saying you're violating someone's human rights. Let's go back to the shoplifting example. Let's say I shoplift from you. You own a shop. Or better yet, you just have a home, right? And I steal your car, right? And you weren't using your car for the next week. You were going to, do something. But I steal it. But then I get it refurbished and I bring it back a week later. Would you say, oh, well, it was of benefit to me, so I'm okay that he stole my car. It shouldn't be a crime. Would you say that?
Yeah, you asked the strangest hypothetical. So in this scenario, my car is stolen, but they actually make my car way better and return it to me?
Yes.
And so over this last week, I've just been suffering by not knowing where my car is and having to deal with not
Should
having
it be
a car
crime?
for a week.
Yes. Should it be
Then
a crime?
I would say overall the benefit was less than the downsides. So if
So it shouldn't have been a crime.
benefit scenario, the benefit that they gave me is not worth the cost.
I think that that's a terrible way to look at how law should apply, right? Because the idea then, because what happens is then all of a sudden you'll get into subjective reasoning. Well, who defines what's good and bad? Some cases you could say, well, yeah, clearly if you refurbish the car, but what if I refurbished it in a way that I thought was great and it increased the value?
This is a stupid hypothetical.
It's not stupid because it's getting to the core belief.
It's not.
The reason this isn't stupid is you just said something. You just said that we should allow people to break the law as long as we could articulate that it's beneficial to the rest of us. And so therefore, that's what you just said, right? And I'm articulating I'm exactly opposite of that. Because what's going to happen is when we're talking about how are these people's rights being violated, you've already said, yes, in certain circumstances, if people break the law, then we could take away things that we would normally call their rights, but it's justified because they broke the law, right? You're just saying that you think that the punishment at this point is more severe than the crime. I say no. I think the punishment of coming here illegally, or the crime of coming here illegally, the punishment should be to send you back. That seems to be a reciprocal punishment to what that should be. Then when I'm like, so how does this affect rights? All you do is talk about the economic benefit. I'm more than happy to have a discussion about economic benefit, but it should not be contingent on whether or not someone's rights are being violated, if whether or not they benefit the economy of this country. It is not a violation of someone's rights to kick them out if they broke the law. You might say it's practically a bad solution because it'll financially harm the country, but that's different than saying that it's violating their rights.
Let me push back on this a little bit because I used to be in favor of the death penalty. I thought for child offenders and stuff. I used to be in favor of the death penalty for that, but then I got into an argument with somebody who did professional counseling and therapy of sex offenders for a living. And they gave me a very good explanation for why that doesn't make any sense. And so in that instance, they were able to convince me that the punishment was not good at addressing the crime, even though morally I thought it makes sense. This person's a danger to society, just nix them out of society, get them out of there. Morally, it made sense to me, but they gave an argument from pragmatics, from economics that convinced me that the death penalty is not good for the nation as a whole, for our economy. that is what convinced me there. So I think, like, yeah, you can say, oh, well, Grayson, the first word that Grayson said was human rights, so everything else that he says doesn't matter. And like all his economic arguments are not pertinent at all because they're not human rights. But again, I do think that the economic matters should factor into our punishments for crimes. It's not all just, oh, well,
I'm not, but you're misunderstanding me.
And they need to be kicked out.
You're
I want to look at the whole picture.
You're misunderstanding. You're misunderstanding me. You could make it is a separate tier of arguments to make pragmatic economic arguments when discussing whether or not someone should be removed from the country. That's different. You may say, look, the reason we shouldn't remove these people is because it would harm us economically. And actually, because our birth rates are declining, we need these certain amounts of people, right? You may make that argument. That's a different argument I'm willing to have. That's absolutely fine. That's a different argument than we shouldn't be allowed to kick these people out because of human rights. Human rights shouldn't be contingent on the pragmatism of whether or not these specific people help the economy. You don't really have a good answer as to why it is violating someone's human rights if they broke the law to remove them from the country.
I do. Let me try to give you the answer again, right? I think that you already know it, but like, look, the punishment should fit the crime. Again, this is our disagreement. I don't think that the crime is deserving of a punishment of deportation. You do. That's our source of disagreement. Like, for me, like you're saying, well, they broke the law, so they need the punishment. But like, if you get a speeding ticket, that doesn't make sense for them to deport your family for it. Like, it has to be making sense. Right?
It does make sense.
I know that you think that is disanalogous because I've gone to absurd degrees with it. But to me, the crime of illegal entry doesn't fit the punishment of deportation because it's a punishment for everyone. It punishes the entire nation and the economy.
So what? We could say that about a litany of other things, and it's not a violation.
I think it's bad to punish the entire nation and the economy.
But that's not a question. That's not a question of their rights being violated. Again, I'll repeat: if I get arrested for non-payment of child support and I'm taken away from my wife and child, is that punishing my wife and child?
If you're okay,
I have a child to another woman. I don't pay child support. So they send my ass to jail. Now I can't be out there making money for the other woman and child. And isn't that a punishment to my current wife and her child?
I do actually think that is a punishment that is too severe to the crime.
So my human rights would have been violated.
Yeah, I do think that was too severe for the crime.
It's an outrageous statement to have.
No, okay, look. Okay, I don't think that we should all be punished because somebody immigrated illegally. Like,
but that has nothing to do with rights.
Because immigration, legal or illegal, is a net benefit for the country. The vast majority of economists agree with that on both sides of the political aisle.
That's not true.
It is true. Like a little, an interdisciplinary, across both sides, a congressional budgetary office analysis showed, like, this is Republican and Dems in 2007 under the Bush administration, and they were showing that illegal and legal immigration has more economic benefits than negative.
Okay, 2 questions. So now if we want to switch from the rights argument to the economic argument, no problem with that. 2 questions I have.
I can still do the rights argument, but
2 questions I have on this, right? One, then if we could prove that a specific person or a specific subsect of people are economically detrimental to us, should we be allowed to remove them?
You're meaning like
me and you're both illegal. We both have families. You bust your ass, you go to work every day, you're a contributing member of society, you're on the local, volunteer fire team, you're doing a bunch of good shit for your community. I'm a layabout, I get drunk sitting on the stoop every day, I'm living off government expenditures, etc., etc. Should they, if the government does an analysis and says Rob Noerr is a drain on our economy, he's here illegally, we could remove him, but we're not going to remove Grayson. Is my human rights been violated?
Yeah, this is actually a very good point. I appreciate you bringing this up. Because I don't think that we should just deport homeless people. Those are homeless U.S. citizens. In terms of like illegal, undocumented people that don't have a job, they're an economic drain on the country. My initial moral intuition is that I don't think that we should deport those people, but I don't have as much of a logical, empirical justification for that. Those are just my moral intuitions about it.
So then if the Trump administration starts by deporting people that have already been given deportation orders and criminals, you'd be okay with that. As long as it doesn't go further than that,
To
correct?
deport like people that are already in jails and like
Well,
have committed
so the
violent
two
crime.
group, yes, the people that are illegals that have already committed violent crimes, or whether they're
Yeah.
in jail or not,
I wouldn't. I
or
would not have an issue with
okay, and the
deporting
second
like
group,
actual violent criminals that are here illegally.
right? So there's an illegal, they do a terrible assault to a woman. I don't know, TOS, what you're allowed to say.
We don't really need any like example. I already agreed with you.
Okay, so that person's gone, whether they're already in jail or not. What about the person that's already been given deportation orders?
Well, what crime did they do?
Well, for example, when people come for asylum seeking or other things, they're supposed to go to a hearing and then they determine whether or not the claim for asylum was legitimate or not. Sometimes the courts say, no, it's not legitimate, you have to leave. But people just don't show up to leave. Should those people be deported? They have a chance. They know that they've been told, dude, you got to go. They haven't been here 20, 30 years, and they're just like, nah, I'm not going to go. Should we be allowed to deport those people?
It's a gray area for me. Because I understand arguments both for and against. Like, if you argue that they should stay because they could be productive members of society, or they're the only crime that they did was a non-violent crime. I understand that argument. I also understand the argument that you could be potentially incentivizing more people to do that. And so it's more of a gray area for me. I don't know if I would be able to give you a firm stance on that.
I don't know how that could be gray, because then the lesson is anyone that comes could get in. Because our court would say, no, you can't be here. And they'd say, yeah, I'm going to stay. And you'd be like, oh, well, what can we do?
So specifically, I think that we should incentivize legal immigration by making the legal immigration process easier than the illegal process. Because the illegal process sucks for a lot of people. It's expensive. You have to deal with coyotes. It's dangerous. People don't want to do that. They'd rather go legally, but there's, for whatever reason, they think that they can't get in the legal process. So I think we should make the legal process easier to disincentivize the illegal process.
But that's irrelevant to what we should do with the people that are here illegally. And if we can't even agree, for example, if we,
I think that there should be a path for citizenship for those people that, like, basically, here's the thing: to discourage future incentivization. At the same time, when you make legal immigration easier, that process easier, then you also provide a pathway to citizenship for the people that are already here, while saying in the future, everyone that comes, will not get that same opportunity, to disincentivize it from happening in the future.
That's unpersuasive to me, and I think the majority of Americans that would say, oh, okay, everyone that's here has complete amnesty, even those that the courts have already ruled should be removed. You're all here. You're in, unless you committed a super violent crime. Other than that, you're in. But now trust us, now that we've given what the very people that allowed these illegals to come in the first place wanted by saying, oh, and we're going to massively open up legal, the rest of the people, it's not persuasive. And then I'll go further with this.
Why is it not persuasive, though? Because isn't it logical, or what is illogical about it?
It's not logical, because you can't tell people that have literally been given deportation orders that they don't have to leave. And
what is illogical about it?
Because if we have a court that says that we've already told you that you can't be here, and we say that's irrelevant, we don't care, as long as we give people like you the immigration policy that you want. Because imagine, we go exactly with Grayson's numbers. Grayson says, okay, I've looked into this, I've spent a year studying it. Here's exactly what our new legal immigration should be. And it's going to increase legal immigration by 95%. And it's going to make it so much easier. It'll only take 2 weeks for the people to apply. But there will still be people that are left out. And then someone's going to say, I care about human rights more than Grayson. These people should have been kept out. So if they come here illegally, we should allow those people to stay and then readjust the immigration system to one I want.
But I failed to see how any of that showed that what I said was not logical. Like, you're giving me a slippery slope argument, which is a fallacy.
It's not a fallacy. The logical nature is this. If our courts already said you have to go, and you say no, they shouldn't have to go, even when the courts, we shouldn't be allowed to remove them, unless you have the specific policy that I want, which would allow that person in, then we'll say, okay.
Right. Roe v. Wade was the law of the land for a while, and then those laws changed. So why would the court mandating a deportation, but then the legislation introduces this new legal process and naturalizes citizens that are here, that would
It's terrible
supersede
policy.
that in the same way
It
that
incentivizes.
precedent changes.
Okay, so let's just say, will you agree with this? There's zero chance in the next 4 years that we get the immigration policy that you want.
Yeah.
So practically, anyone who comes here illegally for the next 4 years, even if a court says you can't be here, you would say it would be wrong to remove them.
Not anybody, but sure.
If they're not a violent criminal, you would say yes.
Non-violent criminals.
Okay, that's absurd. What you've just done is incentivize the entire world's population that is a non-violent criminal to come here. Now, what we were doing was going through the stages of severity, right? So I thought the people that had already been given.
What's wrong with having non-violent criminals come here?
We don't want to incentivize everyone. I'll explain it if you let me get to my next point.
Okay.
The core principle that I have is this government exists for the rights of the citizens of this country. And it is just an extension of our will. And so therefore, we are completely legitimate to say we only want people to come into this country that are beneficial to us. So what I was doing is, you already admitted, yeah, it's a difficult question if Rob's the illegal that's a net drain, whether or not we should kick them out. So what I was doing was going incrementally. You agree with the terrorists, those people kicked out, the violent criminals. Yes, I'm glad you agree with that. That's sensible. The next level of severity is the people that have come here in like the past couple of years that have already been given deportation orders. You say no, they should be allowed to stay, which shocks me. Now let's go to the next level of severity. Should our government be able to look on a case-by-case basis and say, you're a net drain, you're out, you're good, you stay? Yeah, that's what our immigration policy shouldn't exist, because we owe the world something, and that there is a human right for anyone who wants to live here. Our immigration policy should be one that's designed to benefit the people of this country. And so if this person comes and we say, yes, that person will benefit, then we allow them in. But if this person comes and we say, no, this person's going to be a net drain, then they are not allowed in. That's what a sensible immigration policy is.
So I think I understand in principle with you right there, because I think that overall, I mean, immigration is a net benefit on average, but I see what you're saying, where it could be even more beneficial if you were to take the people that are not benefiting and say they can't come or deport them or whatever. Like, it starts to get to a weird situation with me when you're looking at it like on a point by point basis like that. Because then it's like, you know,
well, do you understand how we come to this? Because we're talking about this discussion of rights, and then you're like, but these people are beneficial economically. Okay, let's say I agree with you. But surely we could see, even if 80% of these people are good economically, you'll be able to pick out specific people within them that aren't beneficial to us economically.
Yeah, I agree.
So the question
there are going to be some that are more beneficial and others that are maybe not beneficial.
Is it a human rights violation for us to say, no, you're a net drain, you're gone?
Yeah, it's just like, you know, that saying about like the greatness of a society is how you treat the members of your society that are not, I forget the whole thing, but it's about like elderly and disabled people and all that stuff. Like, it sounds to me like it's almost bordering on this eugenics policy if you're looking at it on an individual basis. Like, typically when you make laws for populations, not on an individual basis. So like this policy of like, let's look at the individual and see if they get to be beneficial, this individual can stay. If they're going to be a net drain on the system, they leave. That is almost approaching this like, oh, well, if your baby is going to be born special needs, then you should get rid of it, like kind of stuff.
No, that's not doing that whatsoever, because we're already the equivalent. Like, we do this all the time with all sorts of things, right? We decide whether or not something, for example, we're giving a business permit. The United States decides whether or not they want to get into a business relationship with a foreign-owned company. Mm-hmm. We don't say we must accept being in a business relation with any foreign-owned country. Of course not. We say, well, will this business arrangement be beneficial for the United States?
Yeah.
We're not like, you have to understand, of course, when it comes to people that are citizens of this country, you can't do shit like that. You can't be like, yeah, we're going to deport you because we think you're an next drain. But when we're talking about people that came here illegally, or the people that we're going to get left in, why shouldn't we as citizens be allowed to say, we're only going to leave people in that we think will be beneficial? Now, maybe
Can I answer that real quick?
Sure.
So the way I'm thinking of it is, like, I guess, a little bit different. I understand what you're saying, though. I'm just thinking, like, the thing that I find wrong is, like, the disruption of people's lives that they've built here, right? Like if they're legal or not legal, the thing that I find wrong about deporting somebody, like you're saying, oh, of course we can't do that to U.S. citizens because they're U.S. citizens. Like to me, we can't do that to people because it's wrong, because you're disrupting their lives and their livelihoods. Like to you, it's only wrong to do that to a citizen, but it's fine to do that to someone that's not a citizen.
That broke the law in that very way of coming here.
Yeah,
Yes.
and to me, like I'm just like looking at the situation on the ground. They look the same, right? In terms of what's happening on the ground, I wouldn't be, like if I would just a fly on the wall, you wouldn't be able to tell if that's a citizen or not a citizen if you're just watching somebody who's
What's the relevancy
getting
of
their life
that?
get
You
deported.
can't tell who's a credit card scammer or who's not. So you don't arrest the credit card scammer because just looking at them you can't tell? Of course not.
No. My point is basically like, if you are going to go after the credit card scammer, right? Like, and you are prosecuting them for the crime. Okay, you can look at that and then you can see them doing that to like an innocent person and ruining their life. Those are going to be different situations. You agree, correct?
If someone gets falsely arrested, but that's not analogous. The analogy, that would be analogous to someone getting deported that's not an illegal. Yes, we would agree that's bad.
Yeah,
but
I'm saying like there's a clear difference in those two scenarios, because in the one instance for the guy doing the credit card fraud, like the disruption in their life, like it is going to be different than the person who's innocent. The disruption in the life of someone who's a citizen versus not a citizen, what is the difference of like in terms of the household that they've established, the families they've had, the jobs that they have in
this
this
is
country?
the same argument with the credit card scammer. What's the
You
difference
walk
in
me
there?
through why it's the same argument.
I've scammed people through credit cards. You haven't. The police walk through. They don't know anything about us. They're just looking at our houses. Can they tell, looking at my house, credit card scammer, and then looking at your house, he's not?
No, they would obviously have to look at it more detailed than that.
But I've built a life. I have a family. I have neighbors that like me. I have dogs. I have guinea pigs, right? So it wouldn't be right to punish me. What we're talking about specifically is, of course, any innocent person that gets caught up in something's terrible, but we're talking about people that have violated our policies and laws. And even though you might say, but they look the same as the guy who didn't violate the policies and law, doesn't change the fact they violated that policy or law. And it is a legitimate punishment to say, you can't be here. We're going to send you home. If you want to come back the legal way, you could attempt, but you came here illegal. To say, but they look the same as the person who didn't break the law isn't an argument.
Yeah, I just think like if I'm looking at the situation playing out on the ground and I cannot tell a difference, and I consider one of them, like you consider one of them to be morally wrong and the other one to be morally right, but when you're actually looking at the situation play out on the ground, you cannot tell the difference between the situation that's morally wrong and the situation that's morally right. I think you could tell the difference in the credit card scammer example. I think you could, if you're watching those two processes play out, I think you could tell the example of the credit card scammer versus the guy who's not.
That's outrageous. Not only do I
Really?
can prove that that's bullshit. You know how many times they find serial killers that everyone's like, oh my God, we had no idea. He seemed like a normal guy. If you can't tell who's a serial killer, how in the hell can you say that you would be able to walk through a community and point out everyone who's committed a crime like credit card scam? That's absurd. Everyone knows
really
that's
don't
not
think
true.
That this is analogous. So you're saying that like the arrest and prosecution of a serial killer versus somebody that's innocent and accused of the crime of serial killing, you would not be able to tell the difference between those if you were just a fly on the wall watching those play out? Like you wouldn't be able to see that there's a lack of evidence in the first one?
Well, now you're changing. You're saying once we investigate and find proof that somene's a serial killer.
Isn't that part of the process?
Right, but that's part of the process of finding the people that are illegal. But your
like
argument
it doesn't
is,
matter to me. Like in the illegal versus not legal, no matter how much they investigate, it doesn't change the situation on the ground. Like it does change for the murderer one.
I don't understand. I think the point you're trying, it doesn't make sense what you're saying, because your argument seems to be because family A, the Smiths, and family B, the Robinsons, well, it turns out the Smiths are illegal and the Robinsons aren't.
Yeah.
But just looking, you can't tell, right? But if the Smiths committed credit card fraud and
it wasn't just like the families, you can't tell who's illegal and who's not illegal. I'm talking about specifically the process of deportation. Like they're both getting deported. one of them has documentation, the other one doesn't, and like you can clearly, you can see, but the actual dynamics on the ground of the process being carried out,
This is the same for any
equally morally
crime.
wrong.
This is the same for any crime. Any crime theoretically.
I don't think it is, though.
How? How would you know the difference until you have proof?
No, but that's the thing, though. It's like I'm accounting for the entire investigation process and the process of amassing the evidence in my.
I'm just gonna have to say I have no idea what you're talking about. If your argument is because people that are illegal don't look like illegals, therefore it's,
that's not my argument.
Okay, then I don't know what you're saying.
I'm
you
saying
move on to another point.
The process of carrying out the mass deportations is what I find to be a violation of human rights, whether or not the person is documented or not documented. And I'm saying that the actual process of prosecuting a serial killer is not analogous because that process does have differences in the moral character if that person is guilty or innocent as part of the process of the investigation.
The serial killer analogy was just to prove that you can't tell that someone committed a crime by looking at them. That seemed to be what you were suggesting. Okay, do you want to move on to something else? Like
I did think that we were going to go max for 2 hours and we're approaching 3. So if I'm no longer making sense, that could just be because this is a lot more of a conversation than I thought we were going to have. And typically I don't do anything longer than 2 hours.
Okay. So, well, if you're ready to go, that's fine.
So I think that we didn't get to a lot of the subjects, but we got to like 2 out of the 3. I wanted to touch a little bit about foreign policy, but like
you want to do rapid fire 10 minutes?
Considering it's taking us like over an hour for each of these, I don't know if we're going to be able to do that.
10 minutes, we'll set a timer. It's 9:52. At 10:52, we're done mid-sentence. Okay. I don't give a shit.
Here's
Go
my
ahead, foreign policy.
To lay it out about foreign policy for Trump, right? I think generally it is going to be more destabilizing for the global order to let Putin get away with conquering territory because it sends a message to all the other dictators or Xi Jinping that, hey, you can get away with taking territory and the U.S. is going to let you have it. So I think, this could be resolved if Trump did not give that territory to Putin and made it like an independent border, like buffer state. I'd be happy to see that. But yeah, I don't think that he's good for global stability.
Okay, let's just talk specifically on Ukraine. I'll say in general, same argument people made in 2016. The world was much more stable under Trump in 2016 in his term than it was under Obama or Biden. So I think that history proves that you're wrong. But to talk about this specific issue of Ukraine, I don't know what you mean buffer state. So you mean take Zelensky out of power, take the Ukrainian government out of power, and then have it be sort of a U.S. vassal state?
No, I'm saying the conquered territory of like Zaporizhia, the Donbass, and Crimea should not be a part of the Russian state. It should be an independent buffer state in between Ukraine and Russia. If you're going to not give it back to Ukraine, you know what I mean?
So do you think Zelensky would be okay with that?
I don't know, but they're not going to get that territory back. I think anyone who's a realist at this point understands that Ukraine is not going to take that territory back from Putin. I think that giving that territory to Putin for Russia to administer just sends the message that he successfully conquered territory and got away with it, and the U.S. was unable to stop him. So that's going to be sending a message to Xi Jinping and a bunch of other dictators around the world.
The buffer state argument, this is just sort of, practically it wouldn't play out. It's nonsensical because what would happen would be it would end up going one way or the other with sort of how they govern. Like who would govern it? Who would have the finances to it? Like what would you do if, for example, they elect a leader in Crimea that's now its own country of Crimea and that leader says, and we are swearing fealty to Vladimir Putin. What would you do? Would you say that democratically they don't have the right to say that? And if they said we're swearing fealty to Zelensky, then Russia's going to say, okay, we're right back to square one. Yeah. There's just no way to enforce an independent buffer zone.
All this has been tried throughout history to varying degrees of success. Belarus is an example of a buffer state that was created specifically to be a buffer state, and it has gone towards more in Putin's favor. But I don't think anybody makes the argument that it's better for them to have not created it and for Belarus to just be part of Russia from the beginning.
But when was that done?
Huh?
When was Belarus made a country?
I believe in 1991, right?
Like fall Soviet type stuff.
Yeah.
That's clearly a different situation.
Well, they were making buffer states to put in between the West and the former Soviet bloc that
Right,
were
but
going to be
that's
independent buffers. I mean, but this has done, like, they have the demarcation zone in North Korea. That's not a state, but
how's
they
that work?
literally this is a practice that has been done through a lot of history. Like,
It's not practical, right? And what you already said the most important part. First, we have no idea, right? Like I personally think that we should have a peaceful resolution as soon as possible with Trump, and we should stop sending Ukraine money. But they did appoint Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, who's advocated in the past. So, like, for you to say Trump's going to be really bad, like, what do you suspect Trump will do?
I suspect that he'll probably end the conflict on mostly Putin's terms.
I would think that that would be a boon, depending on what those terms are. Let's say that we assume those terms are that Putin keeps a lot of the land that they totally control. I
Yeah.
think that would be of benefit to everyone, including the people of Ukraine. I think that this death is nonsensical, and it was always a pipe dream that somehow there was going to be a force of this land being given back to Ukraine. And it sucks that the
So,
world's like this, but you've already admitted it. Like, it's not going to happen. They're
yeah,
not going
I
to give that
think
land
that
back to
the
Ukraine.
issue is basically destabilization of geopolitical borders, like, beyond the region. So, like, looking at Taiwan, looking at, like, in Africa, Western Sahara, South Sudan, like, there's lots of regions, like, in India, between India and China, there's lots of disputed borders that this kind of just sends the message that where previously the United States had a position that basically borders should not change unless the United States gives the seal of approval, right? And now this leads to a different multipolar world where borders can change and it doesn't matter what the US says. And I'm seeing already the impact
All
of that. I
right.
mean, literally Xi Jinping is eyeing Taiwan
Two
right
things,
off the
two
coast.
things, right? Two things. One, and I will have to admit, someone said this in my chat, which I almost never read my chat, but I will have to admit I saw it. Wasn't Ukraine originally created as a buffer country from the Soviet Union and Russia?
Yeah, but the dissolve of the Soviet Union, yeah.
Okay. I think one of the things that's, I think our foreign policy of interventionism incredibly helped the chances of Russia invading in the first place, such as bombing Syria, having bases in Syria, which is an ally of Russia and Putin, having biolabs so close to Russia, having NATO expansion, etc. Right? And so, but that's obviously we don't have enough time to get into that discussion. I will say this though. I think that a lot of the expansionism that you're seeing from countries like Russia and China, it's not that, oh, because of Trump policy, it's actually the opposite. So there was actually reporting going back as far as 2015 that the CIA actually had a lot of evidence that they covered up, John Brennan covered up, that actually Putin wanted Hillary to win. And the reason was he found their foreign policy to be incredibly predictable. He
Yeah.
knew what lines they could push. He didn't like Trump because he
Sure.
didn't know what lines he could push,
Sure.
which would explain why Trump, who has this sort of, he talks about strong men and appeals to their egos, but then has policies that are very antithetical, such as his policies of exporting fossil fuels, of arming Ukraine, etc. All that shit was bad for Russia, right?
There's a lot of mixed bag. I mean, he lifted a lot of sanctions as well, and also he let, I mean, there's that.
Trump was the most hawkish president on Russia since Reagan.
I don't think I.
Who
can
was more
agree with
hawkish?
that.
Who was more hawkish? Yeah.
Probably Clinton and Bush, because, like, Clinton had a real opportunity to bring Russia into the Western fold after the Soviet Union, and they consistently treated Russia like they were not deserving of a seat at the table. They wanted to keep a boot down
Okay.
on Russia.
And that-
And, like, Clinton really did, like, try to keep Russia in a subservient position rather than welcoming them into a Western alliance that could have had really, really good effects long term. And now we're stuck with the Russian-Chinese
I
alliance.
don't now if that's what you're calling hawkish, I would consider hawkish more of saber rattling, not just we're not going to leave you join our alliances. But if that's what you want to consider, I will agree. And Putin's talked about this, where he even talked about this under Obama, where Obama seemed to be affable to, like, yeah, let's talk about bringing our nations together.
Yeah.
But the heads of the CIA, the people I'm saying are a problem, they were like, no, which would be more
and
reason.
Hillary in the State Department, I agree. Like, I think that there was a missed opportunity. And hey, if Trump can bring Russia in to the fold of the West and away from Chinese influence, I would eat crow on that, and I would be happy to do so. I'd be happy to be wrong about that. But how
I think what
I
you're likely to see is more of the peace through strength that we saw through Trump. And if Trump follows through this time doing better at weeding out bad actors within like the State Department and the intel agency, which countries like Russia specifically blame
yeah.
for the situation in Ukraine, I think that you're more likely to see them be less aggressive. Because
So
I think right now their problem is these agencies.
what about the parts where we saw of Russia being more aggressive under Trump's first term, like where we saw, and I don't think that they have done this for any other administration other than Trump's, where they put bounties on the heads of U.S. soldiers and were paying ISIS members to kill U.S. service
Was that
members.
story confirmed? Because I heard it was debunked, or that it was not debunked, but it was never proven.
I've certainly not heard that. So maybe you're saying it's fake news. I don't know, but
That even if that's true, the net effect of that's still less aggression by Russia than literally invading Ukraine under Obama and Biden.
I mean, look at the Syria policy. I will agree that like Putin was aggressive in terms of invading in Obama and in Trump's, but I really don't see that much of a difference in his overall aggression to the U.S. policy stance in Trump's, other than like the only metric. Well, I mean, that's not even true either, because they also gained a lot of territory in Syria as well during Trump's administration. So I don't know.
Who did? Russia?
It gained territory in all of the administration.
Russia gained territory in Syria. Syria's borders haven't changed,
Look,
to my knowledge, right?
Russia took over a lot of the former U.S. military bases, like in Syria, and now they administer bases in Syria. They took over Syrian airspace. So they did encroach on a lot of, at least maybe not outright state territory, but territory in their sphere of influence. They expanded under Trump's.
But they did that because of the aggressive policies of Obama that started invading Syria in the first place.
No, they did that because Trump pulled out of Syria, and then immediately after Putin went in. Like he just gave all
it's an absurd statement, because Syria is allied with Russia. So Syria, the country, allowing their ally to operate within their country shouldn't be something that concerns us. The fact that the United States was violating Syria's sovereignty by allegedly there to fight ISIS while we were working with Islamic terrorists like al-Nusra, and then simultaneously attacking Assad, and Assad had to rely on Russia to help defend against al-Nusra, the United States, etc. The whole situation represents which represents exactly why the idea of stopping these interventionists in our military and in our intel agency would be a good thing.
But Rob, you're not an interventionist. I'm not an interventionist, so we can agree on that. I just don't think that Trump is a non-interventionist. Ultimately, he tried to do a coup in Venezuela. He's wanting to do regime change right now in Iran, and he's appointing half his cabinet that wants to get in conflict with Iran. I mean, this is not going to be a pro-peace, anti-intervention presidency.
Well, listen, you brought up Ukraine. I know it's time, right? But I'll say that you brought up Ukraine specifically. I'll say this. The worst part of Trump's first administration, well, maybe not the worst, the part that I criticized immediately, thought was shit, was when he bombed Syria. I'm a Ron Paul Republican. I hate this shit, right? And I think that he had people in his ear that was telling him to do bad shit. So I agree with you. If the Trump administration decides to be more hawkish, but I don't think they're going to be more hawkish than Biden, Obama, or what Kamala would have been. There's a better chance that they're less hawkish. And you even, like, there seems to be some tension in what you're saying, because, your immediate gut reaction's like, well, Trump's going to have a peaceful resolution with Ukraine and Russia. You just don't like how that resolution will play out. Like, I don't know. It just seems like when you're saying that Trump's going to be this unique bad person, will you at least admit this? Under the 4 years that Trump was there was far less massive conflict in the world than in the 4 years under Kamala Harris and Biden. Would you admit that?
I just don't attribute that to the president. Like, I attribute that to the fact that there are these global trends going on. Like, I think even Putin has discussed this, that like individual world leaders can only recognize and respond to trends rather than, generating all of this themselves. Like, there are specific reasons why Putin went in after the pandemic, right? I don't think that it had to do with specifically the Biden administration. I know you do. You probably say, oh, he looked at how we got out of Afghanistan and said, oh, that's the U.S. being weak. I don't necessarily buy into that narrative. I look at what Putin has said about his own reasons, and I look at, what he was up to during the pandemic. and it makes sense to me that he chose to go into Ukraine after the pandemic, and the timing for that makes sense, independent of the U.S. president.
I just think that that's detrimental to your overarching argument, which is if Trump has a peaceful resolution in Russia, it will send the signal to Russia to become more aggressive and China to become more aggressive. It seems to me what you're suggesting there is, well, there are just global trends that it doesn't really matter what these individual presidents do or individual leaders do because the trends are going to enforce what people do.
Yes. So, for example, with China, they're responding to the trends of their own demographic collapse from their horrible one-child policy, right? Like, they do not have the consumer base.
You watching Peter Zayan? Is
Zion or whatever? Yeah. I have heard of him. I don't agree with all of his takes, but like they just don't have the consumer base to continue to be the type of superpower that they want in the 21st century. So in order to do that, they have to take Taiwan to support their own ailing economy. Like that is part of the trend that they're observing. That's giving them a reason why to do it. But they also calculate what would the U.S. response be to that? How successful would we be? How supportive would the U.S. people be? And they're looking to the Ukraine response, and they're looking to what happens in Ukraine to inform that calculus.
Look, I think the same argument could be made with the Russia invasion under Obama and under Biden. They had the incentive, demographically, etc., to want to expand, hypothetically. They thought that there was a chance to get away with it under Obama and Biden. They were right. They thought that there wasn't a chance under Trump, so they didn't.
I think that you're almost to the point where I can agree, because I do think that they were emboldened by specific policies of Obama's, at least, like Obama establishing that red line in Syria and then Putin crossing that red line without repercussions. That did embolden Putin. That did embolden China. Like there are those effects, and I acknowledge that Obama for sure. I think that Biden, I'm not. Maybe the Afghanistan thing could have. I'm not sure. But I don't think that. Like I think that actually China and Russia were surprised by how strong and swift the response to the initial Ukraine invasion was. Like they were not expecting the American people to have that much initial support behind Ukraine. And that has eroded over time. And at this point, I do think that the war is stalling and it's only causing more people to die. And it does need to be resolved, because I don't think that Ukraine is going to be able to take back that territory. I just don't think it should be resolved in a way that allows Putin to win and get that territory. Like if we let Putin win, that sends a signal to dictators that they can win against the United States. And I think that is bad for the integrity of borders across the world and international trade.
Okay, I just think that it's inevitable, as you've admitted. Are you willing to go to war to stop that?
You mean like what's inevitable? Like that Ukraine will like
Russia's took that territory. Ukraine ain't getting it back no matter how much money we send to Ukraine.
That's why I support like a buffer state. Like don't give that.
But what if Russia says no, we don't accept that? Then what?
Yeah, then you have to use the powers that we've already been using in terms of funding, sanctions, soft power.
But you just admitted, even with all those tools, it's inevitable. Ukraine ain't getting that land back.
Yeah. So I do think that we need a tougher negotiator. Okay, here's the thing. I just don't have faith that Trump will be a strong negotiator in that. And I'd be happy to be proven wrong in that. It just seems to me that the conflict will be ended on Putin's terms.
That's any negotiator. And the reason for that is Putin's negotiating from a position of strength. And unless you're willing to go to war to kick him out, there ain't no amount of... It's just a time game at this point. You're running out of Ukrainians. They're dying. It doesn't matter how much money you send them. If you're not willing to send troops, at some point, Russia is getting that land. So the best you could do is have a negotiation that's going to have to give some of that land to Russia. And as much as that sucks for the people of Ukraine, I completely agree. I wish that Russia would leave tomorrow. I wish they'd go home. I'm no fucking Putin lover. I think, despite the fact I think U.S. policy helped push them in this direction, it doesn't justify their invasion. And I wish that Zelensky would have won. Like, who knows? Maybe something happens, a meteor hits tomorrow and, yay, Ukraine wins. That would be great. But it's not going to happen. And so you have to be realistic. And the idea that it's like, well, I think it's a detriment to Trump if he has a negotiation where Russia ends up with land. I disagree. I think that the sooner we realize that that's the inevitable solution, the more lives could be saved.
Yeah.
And then
I think
maybe
that
in part of that,
overestimating Russia a little bit. Like I don't think that Russia can just hold out indefinitely like they are in trouble. Like they're having to rely on other countries to help fuel their industrial base to fuel the war effort at this point. Like I think that they are also
They're going to
running on
outlast
fumes.
Ukraine.
Their economy is suffering as well. Like,
have you seen the territorial gains they've had in like the past 6 months? It's getting bad.
Yeah, I do agree. Like the Ukrainians also cannot hold out. Like it's a bad situation either way around. Like I just don't want to give.
Maybe the solution is we give Russia 10% of the land that they've conquered, just like the Crimea. Right? Maybe that's the solution. But a lot of these other gains that they've had, we say you have to give back Ukraine. And then there's assurances that NATO won't accept Ukraine in. I don't know, but our time limit is ran out. If you want to keep going,
real quick, I have one question for you. What do you think that Trump is actually going to do in the Middle East? Do you think that he's going to fix Palestine and Israel? Or do you think that that's just going to continue to get worse and worse and worse under his administration?
I think that it's a situation that sadly will never be resolved because it's such a deep-seated hatred between, religious hatred that's going on there. I think what you're likely to see is an attempt of peace through strength. I think that Trump will probably go to Israel and say, listen, we're going to have assurances that you're going to stop your sort of counterattack and your aggression, right? And then they're going to go to the people in Palestine's side and say, you got to give up these leaders of Hamas, right? You have to have a change in leadership. We cannot allow you to continue to have these people. And that's likely to see a resolution that will be somewhat temporary. Now, is it temporary for a year? Is it temporary for 10 years? Is it temporary for 20 years? Inevitably, there's probably nothing you could do. Conflict will rise again in that area.
I did see that Netanyahu's aide was saying that they're planning on giving the Trump administration a gift in January, where they're meeting right now in Lebanon to try to have a ceasefire on the Lebanese front. And they're even before Trump is even getting into office, Netanyahu is just trying to give his administration this gift. So I think that's kind of like putting your thumb on the trigger, like Iran did back in the 1980 election with Jimmy Carter, and they were secretly negotiating with Reagan behind the scenes to release the hostages day one of his presidency. Like, it's just kind of...
Here's what should happen, in my estimation. We're not going to send Israel any money or Hamas anymore.
We can actually agree. I think that we should use our support of Israel as leverage to try to get them to stop.
I agree. We should do that. I don't know that that's what.
Wait, Rob. Let's just agree. Let's just end it with a little spot of agreement on that. Okay. And also, awesome poster of The Big Lebowski behind you. The Dude Abides. One of my favorite movies of all time.
It's my all-time favorite. That and Caddyshack. But
okay,
I have a quote of it somewhere. It's not hanging up anymore. But,
we can agree on The Big Lebowski is an awesome movie, and yeah, I did find at certain points this was a very frustrating conversation to have with you because I felt like we were getting bogged down in boring details that we could go back and forth on later, and I felt like that was maybe boring for the viewers, but
my audience really liked it.
Okay.
But I enjoy that too. I think sometimes when you're too vague and you're unwilling to for me, the type of discussion, if you watch me, is like, I'll do an 8-hour debate with someone on one specific topic. And try
I get that from you now. I should have watched you more before because I didn't understand that before, but now I get that vibe from you.
So, well, all right. I appreciate. Okay.
In the future, we probably would have to agree on a more specific topic.
Get a moderator.
Then we could agree, like, here's the sources that we're going to be looking at, and then we could have them ready to go rather than Googling stuff on the fly.
Well, I mean, my opinion, what I tried to do in this debate was to allow you to steer the topics to the things you wanted to talk about. So when you say, I'm criticizing Trump for this, particularly methane emissions and greenhouse, I don't think it's out of bounds for me to be like, well, let's look at that. Let's look at that data. It seems like if you wanted to make that argument, either you should have been prepared with that data beforehand, or you shouldn't be that upset with having to look it up because you brought it up. It's the same. Like if you bring something,
I thought we had more common ground maybe than we did because I thought that anybody would be able to obviously agree that rolling back these regulations would, per force, cause increase in global emissions. I really did not think that was the kind of thing that you were going to be so pedantic on a source about. I really thought that anyone would just acknowledge that point and we would continue on the arguments. That's what I really
I've
think.
already argued why that was, because I think the net was still that it decreased, and so it doesn't matter if something I could make the argument that we would have made in debate if you wanted. Actually, no, because what will happen is the regulations you want will hurt the economy, and nations have shown over and over again when they suffer economically that the first thing they do is go with cheap resources. So they'll start mining more coal, they'll start cutting more into their indigenous forests, which will actually lead to an increase in emissions because we have these regulations. So the idea that it's just ipso facto, you decrease regulations, you lead to an increase in emission is not true. So instead of getting in that discussion, I was just
support you on that though.
What's that?
I don't think the data supports
Well,
you.
there's even more specific things we could do. For example, we could
wait, we're going all the way back into. I was literally wrapping up, and we're getting.
That's
back
right, but
maybe we should have a debate specifically on climate change or something, or climate
whatever
change policy.
we could do.
I don't know, but
we could. I'm fine with that. I'm just saying that for me, instead of looking at hypotheticals, I looked at the raw data. That's it. I thought that made sense.
Okay, okay. I don't think that it's fair to characterize your strategy because you gave me so many hypotheticals tonight, Rob. Like so many crazy.
No. That's fine. Again, let's go back to what you said. Nuance matters, right? When we're talking about how bad will emissions get, I don't think it's wrong to look at the raw data and say, well, this is what happened. People said Trump's first administration was going to be a disaster. Let's look at how it ended, right? And to say, no, those shouldn't be the preferable numbers. You understand,
but you already know why I think that it's misleading to do that kind of analysis. And why I think that it's lying with the numbers because, again, it's too multivariate to try to tease out the conclusions that you're drawing.
I think you're lying with the numbers when you say that it wasn't a decrease. Instead, we should look at what people estimate would have been the decrease had Trump not done these policies. I think that's disingenuous and lying.
What other term you want me to use for that instead? But okay, I think it's just a semantic.
I've said my piece on it. I think that most people would agree with me. If you told people emissions went down, they would say, oh, the number of emissions were here, and then they went down to here. They wouldn't say, oh, when you say the emissions went down, or the emissions went up, what you mean is they were here and they went down to here, but actually if Trump wouldn't have done these policies, they would have been up here. It's like, no, that's not how people think.
They went up relative to if anyone else had been president, or not anyone else, but a Democrat or whatever.
Well, we're just beating a dead horse at this point.
We definitely are, Rob. But hey, I think you're pretty good at that.
I think.
Sorry, I had to just get one last dig.
It's all right, I don't mind. I'm
gonna wrap down the stream. So thank you, everyone.
Right, take it easy.
Stop by. Don't.
You mind if I head out?
All that's good stuff. So I'm gonna end the stream here, and I'll stick around in the StreamYard a little bit.